Yeah, good morning, everybody. Sorry for the late start. We wanted to give people time to get here and navigate the traffic of Sandton, particularly when the robots are not working. So thank you all for coming. Today is, I think we're on 5 of 6 consultations that we've been running with various social partners to the PCC to get your views on the NDC. And it fits into a broader sequence of events that we've been hosting. We hosted events at the end of last year in November that were capacity building events, trying to help people understand what is an NDC, where does it come from, etc. And then we are now hopefully hosting a session with you where you'll share with us your thoughts. And we're doing these within the social partners. So we've had labor, business, government, civil society, etc. And the third round will be bringing us all back together to debate differences and agree on similarities. And then we will draft our advice on the NDC, and we'll pick up on this a little bit more just now and submit that to the president and to cabinet probably around June is the plan, but we'll see how things go. So that's how today fits into the whole idea. This morning we are going to have a welcome and opening from Commissioner Yarwich, and then I'm going to come back and do a quick overview of the NDC. So basically repeat the capacity building that we did, but instead of taking 4 hours, I'm going to take 20 to 30 minutes. Possibly slightly longer. And then we're going to have inputs from various business representatives. So we're going to have inputs from the Black Business Council, from the Minerals Council of South Africa, from BUSA, and from NBI. And then we're going to take a break, which you'll probably need by then, and come back and do an opportunity for you to really let us know what you feel. We'll have plenary discussion, but we'll also do some post-it note exercises. And for those of you online, there are about 60 people online. We have replicated that kind of post-it notes infrastructure online, so you'll be able to do the exercises along with us. And then we'll close and hope that you have a good rest of the day. So that's kind of the agenda for today. Any thoughts or questions at this point? Okay, good. It's meant to be a participatory process, so we don't mind running behind on the program if there are burning issues that you want to talk about. So, while the agenda has times next to it, we're relatively flexible. Okay, so I'm then going to invite Joanne Yarwich, who's a commissioner and is currently head of the JET PMU, the project management unit of the Just Energy Transition. And some of you will know her as the former CEO of the National Business Initiative. And she's going to give us a welcome and opening. Thanks, Joanne.
Thanks. Okay, I'm trying to put the camera on. Okay. All right. Morning, everybody, and my apologies for not actually being with you in person. I've sat in on little bits of these consultations, and they have been fascinating, and I'm sure that the conversation at this one will be equally interesting. I thought that by way of welcome, there are a couple of maybe some framing comments that I could make. And I'm sure top of mind for you all is the current geopolitical context, and in particular, the kinds of approach that the US, the increasingly isolationist approach that the US is taking, and the impact that that has on both international relations and on trade, big issues. And I do think that it has enormous implications for South Africa, in particular in the context of a year in which we are hosting the G20. And I think that if you look at the kinds of the speeches that the president has made in opening both the G20 foreign ministers meeting and the G20 finance ministers meeting, the issues of climate change, both in relation to resilience and adaptation and in relation to mitigation and green industrialization, have been top of agenda, as has been a very strong commitment by the South African government to multilateralism. What does that mean for the NDC and for climate? I think it does mean that we will, as the year goes on, increasingly, my sense is, be taking leadership positions globally, or trying to take leadership positions globally, and trying to find ways through the complexities of the broader situation. What it also does mean, I think, in relation to the NDC, is that our NDC is going to be something that's going to be looked at very closely. I think it links very much to issues of financing and trade going forward. I'm certain that the issues of CBAM and the risks that it poses and the appropriate responses in relation to the NDC will be one of the issues that will be discussed in this sector, in this session. But I think it's very important that we not only look at what is happening domestically, but we're going to have to take into account the broader context. So Steve, in his presentation, will talk in much more depth about the NDC, about the commitments that we've made under the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, and what that means for business. But I want to end with one last set of comments. A few years ago, BUSA, together with the NBI, did this work on net zero 2050 pathways for South African industry in a very different political context. However, that work is very broad and future orientated. And I do think that the climate agenda is not going to go away. It's going to have enormous impacts, both in terms of what we have to deal with domestically in terms of adaptation and climate impacts, as well as in relation to our trade, our approach to trade internationally, and our competitiveness into the long term. And so it does seem to me that one of the things that would be a critical input into the climate debate over the next few years is a very serious and detailed set of work by business to be able to say, if we look at the 2030, 2035, 2040 and beyond horizon, here is what business can or can't do in particular sectors. This is what would or wouldn't enable it. And this is what business needs, the kind of support that business would need in order to be able to achieve that. And I think that until we do sufficiently detailed work to be able to set out what the requirements of business are and what the opportunities are, we're going to sit in a debate that does go round in circles, and potentially with outcomes that I don't think are going to necessarily support the ambition of business. So, I mean, I wanted to raise it in this issue. I mean, I was at the Mining in Durban a few weeks ago. I've just been at the Financing Commons Summit. And it seems to me that what we don't have as a country are to put the kind of plans on the table in a sufficiently detailed way that can attract the kind of investment and the kind of support that we need, let alone addressing the kind of policy and regulatory blockages that would really allow business to do what it would want to do. So, yeah, just by way of a conversation starter, thank you very much. Thanks to Steve and the Commission. I'm looking forward to the rest of the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanne. So, I mean, a couple of quick housekeeping things that I failed to mention before. Please return your badges to us at the end of the day. We are desperately trying to recycle. Also, if you need the bathroom, they're out the door, down the steps, and there's like a passage to the left of the restaurant, and they're down there. And the restaurant is where we'll have lunch. So that's an important thing to note. And then also, please feel free to speak. My terrible contribution to this is that I only speak English, but please feel free to speak, ask questions and make comments in your own language. We have enough people in the team that we cover most of the official languages in South Africa, with possibly the exception of sign language. So please, feel comfortable to speak in your own language. I think it's also important to note that this is a commissioner-led process. So you'll see a couple of commissioners on the program today, but they're all paying attention to what's happening in these discussions. And for those of you who don't know the PCC, the commissioners are appointed by the president, and there are commissioners from all of the social partners, labor, business, government, civil society. There are youth commissioners, there are faith commissioners, there are specialist commissioners, particularly around water and agriculture. And they are the ones that make the recommendations. The team that you see here today are part of the secretariat, and on behalf and taking direction from the commissioners, we run the stakeholder sessions, and we do the research and kind of draft things for them, bearing in mind that they all obviously have full-time jobs and so aren't able to do all of these things. So that's important to note. Before I jump into my presentation, I quickly wanted to check how many were able to attend the capacity building sessions that we hosted last year. Okay, that's more than any other group, but obviously not everyone. And how many were able to watch the link to the recording in the invite that we sent out? Okay. Busy sector. But just to make the point that the presentation that I'm going to rush through now is a sort of highlights package of that broader program. So if you want more detail, you are able to log in and watch the recordings of those previous sessions, and we have one for each of the social partners. But really, to help you understand what we are doing here today is just maybe to talk a little bit about what an NDC is. So NDC, National Determined Contribution, is the commitments that we make as South Africa to the overall international negotiations on climate change, and they're effectively a set of targets, right? And the origin of them is quite interesting. So prior to Paris, what the international negotiation process was trying to do was structure top-down binding commitments, and the Kyoto Protocol is the primary example of that. But it didn't work. We couldn't get enough people to agree, and therefore we couldn't cover enough emissions to really make a material impact on climate change. And so at Paris, things flipped around, and we started to focus on bottom-up voluntary commitments, and everybody in the world agreed to submit these. And the NDC process goes hand in hand with a process called the global stocktake. So the idea of this mechanism was that you would submit a commitment, the UNFCCC would then check all of our commitments. Were they ambitious enough? Are we implementing them? Are there any changes to the science? And kind of review them and make some recommendations on what the next round of NDCs would have to look like. And the global stocktake was released in UAE 2 years ago, and basically said we are not being ambitious enough. We're going to fall short of our targets. And so the mechanism is designed that we then globally, every country in the world has to up its commitments based on what we've learned from that process. And so we are now in the next NDC update cycle. Technically, they were due at the end of February, but I think maybe 16 countries met that deadline. And so most countries will submit around September, just prior to COP. And I imagine some countries will submit the week before COP. And as we go through the presentation, you'll see why. This is an incredibly complicated process. And what we've been telling people is the NDC is one way of thinking about how we design the economy. So it's really what we're talking about here. And so it's a very important thing. The PCC have played quite an influential role in the past. So we commissioned in the previous round of NDCs, we commissioned research by UCT at the time, but we also looked at other people's research and the business sector through the pathways work that Joanne mentioned was very influential at the time. And we hosted a whole range of public dialogues. And that resulted in, with other social pressures in the government adjusting the ambition to be more ambitious within the NDC and more aligned with what is in the science. So we're running this process again. So we've commissioned further research, this time not just by UCT, although we have commissioned work with UCT as well, but we've looked at a whole range of other service providers, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. We're also collating the research of others, and again, we're hosting public dialogues. And we will package that up into some advice to the president and his cabinets, including Minister George, on what we think should be in the NDC. Right? It's important to note we are not drafting the NDC. That is the job of the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment, the DFFE. They have the mandated function to do that. So we're not necessarily going to be saying exactly what the NDC should be. We're also going to comment on process and future NDCs and so on. But obviously, the ambition in this NDC is clearly an important area to discuss. And typically, NDCs cover a range of things. They originate out of the mitigation negotiations within the UNFCCC, but they have come to take on also adaptation targets and then means of implementation, which is kind of UN shorthand for the support that we might be able to get. Okay, I'm expecting you to stop me if you have any questions or want to clarify anything, but otherwise I'll barrel on because we want to hear from you. Please ask, and if you do ask a question or have a comment, please can you talk into the mic quite closely so people online can hear you, and introduce yourself, please.
Sure, thanks. It's Justine from First Rand. Steve, you mentioned that countries will be updating their NDCs either now or in September before COP. And I don't know if you'll cover it in your presentation, but is there a mechanism in this year's COP to like a mini stock take, or what is the driver of before COP, and will we be able to get a sense of what these updates are looking like?
Yeah, so I don't think there's another mini stocktake process within the UNFCCC, and I'm not sure they'll have time to do one, given how late some of them will come in. But there are a number of NGOs that are tracking this. Climate Action Tracker is doing it, WRI is doing it, so that you can keep track of what's come out, how ambitious are they, what do they reflect on, and then obviously that will input into, there will be some kind of UN process, but I don't know the details, but I don't think it's going to be a formal process. The formal process is accepting the NDCs and comparing them to the global stocktake. So long answer to say I don't know. Yeah. Okay. So the important thing about the NDC is how it relates to domestic legislation. So we actually commit to producing 2 documents under the Paris and subsequent agreements. One is the NDC, which is really the targets across mitigation and adaptation and means of implementation. And the other is the LEDS, the Low Emissions Development Strategy. And that's the actual plan, like how are we going to do it? A much more detailed and longer and more complex document. And DFFE are currently updating the LEDS, as they are updating the NDC and the sets, which we'll talk about a little bit just now. So that's the international commitment. Technically, these are non-binding international agreements, right? But the mechanism, countries around the world, the way that it works is we take those NDCs and we kind of code them into some kind of domestic legislation. Right. And the way that that works in South Africa is we have the prominent piece of the Climate Change Act, which it's not the only piece of legislation, is obviously the carbon tax and others, but it has its roots in the National Development Plan and NEMA, in the National Climate Policy, and it effectively does 2 important things. It establishes the adaptation system, and it requires basically every government entity to produce a risk and vulnerability assessment and a climate action plan, which is a big job, right? Particularly for local governments. And then it also establishes a mitigation system, which includes the GHG inventory and other things, but predominantly the sets. Now, the sets are sectoral emissions targets, and they are basically like emissions reduction targets, or you could think about them as sort of carbon budgets for the sectors of our economy, right? And the sets are how we kind of create domestic binding rules around achieving our NDC. Does that make sense? So these 2 should kind of add up to each other. And then, of course, to implement the sets, there are a whole range of sector-level policies, which include company-level carbon budgets, but also national policy plans like the IRP or the Integrated Energy Plan or the Gas Master Plan or the South African Renewables Energy Master Plan. These are all sector policies that should add up to give us the sets, which then should add up to give us the NDC. Does that make sense? Okay, so although the international agreements are non-binding, we have the domestic regulation system to bind us to them. Okay, so now we have to update the NDC. You can't just make it up. right? There are rules and guidance on what the NDC should look like, things that we have agreed to do in our international commitments. We've agreed that they will be more ambitious than the previous NDC. The idea is that you're responding to the global stock take and you're updating your ambition so that you can meet the overall temperature goal of well below 2 degrees, ideally below 1.5. Must be aligned with the requirements of science. You have to have gone through some process and effort to see what the science is saying. And notably in the UAE consensus, we emphasize and we agree as countries around the world that staying below 1.5 degrees is really important, and we should peg our NDCs against that. It must represent a country's best effort. We have to have demonstrate that we've thought about this and what is possible, and that we've carefully considered the options, and that we recommend a plan that is our best effort. And then lastly, which is more a transparency requirement, we have to be able to say in our NDC why we think it is fair that we have chosen a particular pathway or target. Does that make sense? So it's not that you can say, well, let's double our emissions because that sounds fun. There has to be some kind of process that thinks this through. Now, the challenge that we have, and you will be very acutely aware of this, is whatever we recommend has to be locally credible. We as South Africans have to think that this is a plausible commitment. It has to be internationally credible, which works on both ends. If we're not ambitious enough, if international partners don't believe that that's possible, that could cause us problems. But also, you can't just submit some massively ambitious plan that you have no chance of achieving, right? That also wouldn't be credible. And of course, it has to be scientifically credible. And there is a lot of tension here. You know, Joanne hinted at some of it. Like, what does internationally credible mean these days? You know, you've got the United States, you've got shifts to the right in Europe. You know, what does that actually mean? Locally credible, you know, in our consultations, we hear extreme views. You know, and so how do we come to some kind of consensus of what is our plan? Scientifically credible is a little bit easier to deal with. There's a huge body of science that tells us quite clearly what needs to be done. But of course, always some interpretation and bias. So we're not, just to say up front, we're not pretending this is an easy process. It's complex, there's multiple perspectives, but it's a very important part of how we think about the future of South Africa's economy. Okay, all right. So, adaptation. What does climate change mean for us, right? And why, therefore, should we respond? So the UN released these big reports every couple of years called assessment reports. We're currently on the assessment report 6, which basically they've reviewed all of the available science, and they produced these like thousands of pages reports and some summaries for policymakers. And for the first time in all of the assessment reports, there's a special chapter on Africa, which specifically looks at the impacts on us. And here are some of them. A 34% reduction in agricultural output, reduced income growth and increased income inequality for African countries more so than anywhere else in the world. And I think that's important to note because climate change impacts the poor the most, at a country level and at a sort of people level, right? You don't have the ability to respond, you don't have insurance, and so on. And so there's a built-in inequality in how climate change impacts people. Over 3.6 million weather-related displacements. So these are people forced from their homes either by slow onset weather changes, drought, etc., or by extreme weather events. And a negative 5% impact on GDP per capita for South Africa. Right? Do these sound good? All right. The worst part is that these are things that have already happened. The forecast is much worse. A 25 to 75% reduction in agricultural outputs, depending on the crop and the temperature scenario. A 50% drop in South Africa's GDP by 2100. There's quite a big range of estimates, but that might even be conservative. And then with 1.7 degrees of global warming, 17 to 40 million climate migrants in sub-Saharan Africa alone. And with 2.5 degrees of warming, 56 to 86 million climate migrants. Where are we headed now? The global stocktake says that if we implement the commitments that we have made, which is looking increasingly likely that we won't. But if we do, we will be in a temperature range of somewhere between 2.1 and 2.8 degrees. So we're somewhere here in this range of people. So basically the population of South Africa displaced from their homes in sub-Saharan Africa. So these are material risks. We have a question at the back. Is it on? It should go red. There we go.
Okay. It's Nontokozo from Nedbank. Just out of curiosity,
Yep.
the South African sets, are they going to be benchmarked with international best practice? And if so, which country are we using as a comparison?
So the sets are currently being consulted on. Or I think this window's just recently closed. The Buso people will know better than me, actually. And so we are currently consulting on the sets for 2025 to 2030. We will still need another round of consultations for 2030 to 2035. And the NDC we are talking about now is 2030 to 2035. There is a whole bunch of things that they are doing to think about the sets, internal modeling within the DFFE, as well as some internet benchmarking, but I wouldn't be able to tell you which countries they've looked at. But there is a definite desire to look at international best practice. But the mechanism is largely driven bottom up. So what is happening is the line departments will set line policy. So the energy department will set the IRP, and then the IRP becomes a material input into what the set is. And then there's some backwards and forwards between the DFFE and the department and other stakeholders. So that's kind of the process. Thank you. Okay, so our position on the kind of physical risk of climate change is it's extreme. We should be doing everything we can to avoid it. These are pretty much unsolvable problems, right? And so we should avoid them. And it gets worse. And if we look at this as private sector stuff, looking at GDP impacts, it's the reinsurance sector, Swiss Re. If we look at the 2.5 degree range that we're heading for, a -14 to -21% impact on GDP by 2050, by mid-century. All right. If we look at work that WITS are doing at the Global Change Institute, they're worried about these three risks. They're called tipping point risks that are becoming increasingly likely as temperatures increase. At day zero in Gauteng, you think about the socioeconomic impacts of running out of water in Gauteng. We had a trial run in Randburg a couple of months ago. It was pretty dire, I have to say. A collapse of maize crop in sub-Saharan Africa, right? And a category 4 or 5 cyclones making landfall on the east coast of South Africa. Where are we planning to build our gas infrastructure? East coast of South Africa, right? And I say this to point out that climate risks have huge economic and social consequences. So we're not just talking about environmental risk here. We're talking about a broad range of environmental, social, and economic risk. But again, these are untenable risks. We must do everything we can to avoid them. And the way that we do that is through mitigation, right? Globally and locally. And to talk to Joanne's earlier points about geopolitics, if we're going to convince the rest of the world to drive their emissions down in order for us to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, we need geopolitical influence. And so the level of ambition that we put in our NDC will determine to some degree the level of that influence. And obviously, in parallel, us being the G20 chair, having received it from Brazil and about to hand it to the US, but also that Brazil are hosting COP30, there's some very important geopolitical connections there. Last point on adaptation, this is also taken from AR6, is the longer we take to respond, the fewer options we have. Right? Does that make sense? So if we only start adapting and mitigating in 10 years' time, we just have fewer options. We're just committed to that much more climate change. And so just to emphasize that the science calls for urgency of action, and you'll see that language throughout the agreements. But the big summary is we need to avoid this kind of climate change and therefore need to have strong mitigation strategies. How do we think about the NDC here? Right, in this resilience adaptation debate. And this is a framework that the business sector produced at the NBI. Resilience defined as preempt and withstand variability or shocks in the social, economic, and environmental conditions. And we've kind of just seen evidence of how these are social, economic, and environmental risks. And we've got to do three broad things. We've got to be able to anticipate what's coming. Can we predict extreme weather? Can we warn people about extreme weather? Adaptation, what do we do about both extreme weather and slow onset change? And then recovery. Right? What happens if we are hit by a crisis, and what do we do about that? And if we think about sort of Durban, KZN floods, we still haven't rebuilt some of those roads and bridges. Right? Recovery is expensive, it's difficult to do. And the more money we spend here on anticipation and adaptation, the less money we spend here. But these are real costs that you incur. And the higher the temperature rise, the worse the climate change, the bigger these costs are. And so when we think about the NDC and we want to think about targets, we can start to think about targets and needs within each of these areas. So for example, strong anticipation ability rests on having a weather service that is able to take readings and make predictions, right? And so Mandy, who leads some of our adaptation work, is doing some work now. What is the state of that monitoring infrastructure? Turns out there's some things to worry about. Right? And therefore, what will it cost us to get that upright? How do you warn people, particularly people in informal communities, say in a flood zone of a river? How do you get messages to them? If you do evacuate them, where do they go? Right? These are the kinds of things that we would have to think through and have targets and goals and needs for. And so we can think our way through this. Some interesting examples in adaptation have come up around, protecting communities. To think about gender. So gender is a particularly important part of this. After an extreme event, violence against women and children goes up. But not only does it go up, but the emergency resources that would normally care for those people are stretched super thin. And so they deprioritize instances of rape kits and things like that. And so there's a huge kind of gender thing that we need to think about in how we think about adaptation. That makes sense. But just to scratch, I'm just scratching at the complexity of this. And so all of these things have to be kind of thought through, and we think about how do we design our economy, what kind of goals do we want to set. But importantly, it gives us clues on what kind of resources we need. And that gives us a sense of what we might be able to include in our means of implementation of signals. Does that make sense? But I think this is a useful framework to think about what is it that we have to do. So what did the global stocktake say? And there is some good news, right? The actions that we have taken since Paris means that we avoided warming of 4 degrees. So if we had done nothing, we would have 4 degrees of warming already, or forecast for 2050. And now we're in the range of 2.1 to 2.8 degrees. So we're at least a degree cooler than we would have otherwise been. So there's some encouragements in that. But there is still a huge gap between where we're headed and where we need to go, which is our target of 1.5 degrees or well below 2 degrees. And the implication of that, if we think about the mechanism as being designed, NDC, global stocktake, NDC, global stocktake, is that we should be enhancing our ambition to meet those goals. Okay, makes sense. Just to lead into the mitigation efforts. The other thing to note is that all of the models in the world pretty much have this kind of shape. You can look at international models, you can look at local models, and to this theme of you need to act now, is most of the action happens in the decade 2030 to 2040. And the NDC we are talking about is the midpoint of that decade, right, 2035. And so what is our current circumstance on mitigation? For those of you that don't know, the UAE consensus basically says that in order for us to stay below 1.5 degrees, we need to have a 43% reduction by 2030 globally and a 60% reduction by 2035. against 2019 emissions levels. So if we apply that to our 2019 emissions levels, just as a thought exercise, we would need to get to 271 by 2030 and 191 by 2035. Right? That's the global kind of trajectory. Now, we're a developing country, so we would expect to be able to go slower than developed countries. So we would expect economies like the US and the UK and Europe to be below the line, right? And we can be above the line and we average out on the line. And that's kind of how we start to think through common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities, which I'm sure that you've all heard of, but it's the center of climate change, which is debate about who's responsible for what. Good question.
Thank you, Steve. Can I just ask, with, for example, Wells Fargo having pulled out of their net zero goal yesterday, and that was just for 2050, and HSBC shifting theirs from 2030 to 2050, even if they even keep that.
Mm-hmm.
How are you going to take that into consideration that the US probably isn't going to do what they need to do?
Yeah.
And how are we going to respond? Do you think at this point? And that's not an easy question.
Yeah, look, who knows is the answer to that question. But I mean, I think the theme is we are seeing backtracking in a range of corporate and state entities around the world, right? And so there's two ways to use that. There's two ways to tell that story, right? Well, we should be allowed to backtrack on our commitments then, right? Where does that logic lead? 4 degrees. Right? The other way to tell that story is because the climate impact is so extreme, if others are backtracking, we need to double our efforts both locally and in our international geopolitics, right? And you'll find people on both sides of that spectrum.
Sorry, I just want to comment. Sorry, excuse me. It just makes
lean
us,
into your mic, please.
It makes us, less commercially competitive as a country, I guess. Looking at international trade and the other countries that are more developed, pulling back on their goals. It seems a bit unrealistic to think that South Africa will still go ahead with tighter nationally determined contribution goals when more developed advanced superpowers are pulling back on their goals. And I know you can also speak about China here, probably like saying China is still pushing ahead, from what we see. But when we look at Europe and the US, they've got a massive impact on the rest of the world and certainly on the profitability of companies globally.
Mm-hmm. Look, there's no question that it changes the operating environment. I think it's very questionable to say that it makes potentially companies less profitable. It depends what business you're in. And we find that the evidence suggests the other way. Right? Even in the discussion about CBAM, which is really interesting, there are some stakeholders that think the CBAM will make us more competitive because it's not the impact on your individual sector that matters, it's the impact on your sector relative to your competitors. So it may be that we emerge more competitive out of these processes. So what I'm saying is the assumptions that we have, we should just be a little bit careful about them because often the evidence suggests otherwise. But for certain sectors, clearly that's very true, particularly if your trade partnerships are with the countries that are, well, I mean, if you're a traditional emitting company, you'll probably be more competitive as a result of some of these changes. So we got to be careful.
I just want to make one last comment about that. The reason why it impacts profitability on some of these companies that are implementing is that it actually costs to re-engineer the business processes and reduce carbon emissions. So, some companies are looking to pull back in a way because instead of investing that money, even into calculating fully, scope 1, 2, and 3, to say, oh, we'll just do scope 1 and 2, maybe look at major supplier for scope 3. We don't really want to invest too heavily now. We want to hold the financing and invest it into other sort of business operations, which could be linked to fossil fuels. So I'm thinking of that in terms of profitability, not investing like Europe is saying that they're saving billions from not pushing through the full omnibus of reporting regulations around sustainability. So it's having that type of impact on profitability. Yeah.
I mean, this is the key question, right? And the debate we would expect to have from this group most of all is, where are these lines now, right? Can we afford not to invest in these things given the impacts that that might put on us, or can we? I don't know. But these are the key debates. But let's explore it a bit more and see what some of the other evidence says. But this is the debate I suspect we'll be having for the rest of the day. So thank you. Okay, so back to this quickly. From an equity point of view, we would expect to be above the line, and we are quite significantly above the line. Our 2025 commitments are 398 to 510. Our 2030 commitments are 350 to 420. And we are currently somewhere around 420, 450. So we're well within this sort of 2025 range, but we will struggle to come in the top end of our 2030 range. So we'll either just come in or miss, as current policy stands, our 2030 NDC goals. And we report more on this in our State of Climate Action report if you are interested. And so then if we just apply the basic logic, and this is just a framework for thinking about it, we're not saying at all that this is what the NDC should look like. This is just a way for us to think about it. We've said we're going to get to net zero by 2050. Maybe it's 2055, maybe it's 2060. And we then draw straight lines from our top end and bottom end to net zero, and we would get a range of 278 to 330 for the 2035 NDC. Right? But if you remember this previous slide, we would expect a slightly more aggressive reduction in the decade 2030 to 2040. And so we would expect the actual points to be slightly below these lines, just as a sort of thought experiment. And if we look at what the various modeling efforts in South Africa do show, we have a bottom end of that range in the JET IP lower bound of 200. Which would be at the bottom of the green circle, and for a 2-degree world, 390 at the top end. Right? And if you then look at, well, where are the sort of most common points? They're around 240, 260, slightly below that bottom end point for 1.5, which is what we expect from our kind of thought experiment. And so we would expect the NDC range somewhere in this green dot, but if we're serious about our 1.5 commitment, you would at least have a bottom range that's in the SAC 250, 260 zone, right? And then, of course, this is the debate that we're having, right? Where do we put this? And the top end and the bottom end can be thought of in quite different ways. You could calibrate the top end on 2 degrees. It wouldn't really be compliant with what we've agreed to do. Remember, the goal is well below 2 degrees. So you could, I guess, generously interpret that as a 1.8 degree target, and then the bottom end on 1.5 degrees. Or you could have the top end as your your unconditional commitment. This is what we will do without any support, and the bottom end your conditional commitment, or some combination thereof. Just to note that if you assume no common but differentiated responsibility and kind of no friction costs in terms of investing, so we could implement the cheapest available solutions in South Africa. If you do that modeling exercise, South Africa gets allocated a carbon budget of 68 megatons in 2035. Right? So that gives you a sense that this idea of we are different, we are special is already baked in to the commitments that we have made. Right? We are already well above the global average line. And how far above is a big part of the debate. And so if you weight historical emissions highly, South Africa is a top 20 emitter historically and today. Even if you take off the emissions that we've traded, we're still a top 20 emitter. Right? And so then you would expect us to be below the line. But we also have the highest poverty, inequality, unemployment in the world, and a history of colonialism and apartheid. So you would expect us to be above the line. But, and this is where it gets a bit tricky and somewhat subjective, is how do you weight those things? You know? Okay, also work by the NBI. The other way to think about this is the area under these curves, right? If you add up every year's emissions, gives you a carbon budget, right? And what we're effectively doing is allocating that carbon budget across each sector of the economy to maximize socioeconomic gain, right? Not an easy exercise. And this is the way that the NBI a couple of years ago allocated that 9 gigaton budget. But you could do it other ways. It's effectively a policy choice, right? And that's part of what we need to understand and bake in particular into the LEDS, the Low Emissions Development Strategy. Okay, so what research have we done? What does this research say? So we've commissioned work across a whole range of areas, either ourselves or working with partners. So we're SA Tide, who are a research arm of Treasury, are doing some really great work, or the NPC are doing some more work than this, but I highlight this piece of work that they're doing, which is particularly interesting around finance. But we've done work with large-scale economic models. We've looked at climate modeling. We've looked at air quality and water modeling. We've done some sector-specific work, particularly in energy, down to the level of grid modeling, where this is emerging for us, starting to do sort of microeconomic modeling. What happens? What do these macroeconomic impacts mean for communities and provinces and so on? And so trying to build up a sort of a broader evidence base for how we think about allocating that carbon budget across economies and accumulating the full impacts in those studies. We've also looked at a whole range of other work being done by different groups in putting into this. But the piece that I wanted to highlight for you is this work done by UCT, where we ran 40 different scenarios, and in those scenarios, you could do a whole range of different things. You could have import localization on or off. You could have a later net zero date. You could have different levels of carbon tax. You know how you manage SASOL for the business sector is very important, and the model's instinct is to close SASOL, so you can allow the model to do that, or you can allow it to decarbonize on the SASOL schedule and plan, or you don't decarbonize SASOL. There's also a real option. And so what do that mean for the economic predictions, right? And this is a slightly complicated chart, but it gives a sense of all of those 40 model runs. And along this x-axis here, you have the carbon budget, right? And so from 8 gigatons to unlimited. And really, this is just a measure of how much we allow ourselves to emit, right? Give me 1 second and I'll come back to you. And then on this vertical axis, we have GDP per capita. And there are a couple of things to note, that for the higher carbon budgets, you have a higher GDP per capita. And you would kind of expect that, because if you're going to reduce your emissions faster, you need to do things like incentivizing electric vehicles, for example, right? And you might take a small GDP hit for that. But there are the two things to notice is the differences are not big. Okay, so we're not talking 100% differences in GDP growth. The other thing to note is that above a budget of 10 gigatons, there is no economic gain. So 11, 12, 13 unlimited carbon budgets, you get the same economic gain as a 10 gigaton budget. So that gives us a kind of anchor point, right? The upper end of our NDC, 10 gigatons. There's no economic gain for being bigger than that. There might be economic gain for going smaller than that, but we kind of anchor on that point. You had a question?
Thank you very much, Chair. My questions, I have two actually. So the first one is with regards to the choice of scenarios that have been used to create those simulations. How do those scenarios actually differ from the ones that have been globally developed by the likes of International Energy Agency, which specifically focuses on creating scenarios specifically for the energy sector on the basis of IPCC Science Foundation.
Yeah.
And the second question is, can we now expect to see the government being the direction that it takes in terms of using those kind of scenarios that are locally developed in comparison to the ones that are globally developed? Because the reason I'm asking that is so is because of I would say regulatory expectations or some kind of like regulations that any other stakeholders, including the banks, which is where we are currently, would be expected to abide by in order to be able to align so that we can sort of like, have more, I would say, precise or aligned climate pathways or projections that we can all align at in order to be able to have some sort of like results that are in sync with what is being developed outside. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, so to the first question, we did look very carefully at the IEA scenarios when we were putting this together. And in fact, if I go back one slide, we modeled these scenarios in two different worlds. A world A, where we decarbonize quicker, and a world B, where we decarbonize slower. We actually used IEA data to help us think through those scenarios. So for example, in a world that moves faster, you actually have lower fossil fuel prices because supply exceeds demand quicker. That makes sense. And in world B, you have higher fossil fuel prices, but demand is also higher. So, we thought very carefully about the IEA scenarios, but we try to kind of customize them to more South Africa conditions. To the second part of your question, I don't know. We can't speak on behalf of government, but just for your interest, we are about to launch a project where we want to co-create scenarios. We now, the PCC, co-create scenario with our stakeholder groups. And so we're going to think about NGFS scenarios. We're going to think about physical risk scenarios. We're going to think about economic scenarios and try to create a common storyline that not just business, but also government, local government, labor, civil society can use. And you can never make people agree, but hopefully if we run that process well, we'll have a set of scenarios that we can use to talk to each other. So the answer's not yet. Yeah.
I just want to comment that I think that that's really going to be valuable and important work. So looking forward to seeing that.
We look forward to your participation. The workshops will kick off probably around end of March, April. So you should hear about them soon. The question at the front. This is good. We're going slowly, but discussion is great. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. I just have a quick question. With the scenarios that you've done and outlined there with the possibilities to check options on and off, is there an accompanying social impact for some of those scenarios? So what will the social outlook be for South Africa? I saw something related to the JET IP, but I'm not sure what the social implications then will be in South Africa for each of those.
Okay, good. Do you want to ask a question? Go ahead.
Thank you. Morning. Can you hear me? Thank you so much. Okay. My name is Rofunoti Chikarange. I'm representing Orisa Consulting Enterprise. We focusing on cyber law and specializing in cybersecurity. The first question I have.
So I actually can't hear you so well. If you can lean in a little bit, thank you.
Is it better now?
That's much better.
Okay,
Yeah, thank you.
When I was looking at the concept that you sent, it highlighted that we committed 398 to 510 megaton COT equivalent for 2025. So we are in 2025. And 350 to 420 by 2030. So I just wanted to understand if we are meeting these targets, if not, to understand the challenges so that when we contribute for the 2030 NDC, we know where we are. And also looking at the UCT scenario, I just wanted to understand if the NDC as is now or the one to come has ESG targets for stakeholders. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so To the socioeconomic question, there are some socioeconomic outputs, but one of the flaws of the big macroeconomic studies is they tend to output things like GDP and gross capital formation and like macroeconomic indicators. And so what we are doing is supplementing this kind of modeling with more detailed socioeconomic work. So I mentioned the micro simulation modeling that we're doing to work out household impact and household skills needs. We've done separate studies on air quality that we're starting to link. So what we did was we passed the emissions profiles of some of these scenarios to a CSR air quality model and did air quality modeling so we could compare. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of those results. I would say though, and why I say while the science is quite good and defensible, there's always frontiers and things that you need to work. And the general modeling landscape in South Africa on some of these socioeconomic issues is weaker in relation to climate change than other areas. And so one of the longer term things that we're doing within the PCC is to try to stimulate more research like that, so we can understand these impacts better. We have a good understanding of some of them, and certainly we have a good understanding of the directionality of them. And generally the lower budgets have better justice outcomes than the higher budgets, but it's not uniform. Right. So obviously, if you close coal quicker, you have bigger and quicker impacts in Mpumalanga and Limpopo. Obviously, if we neglect the automotive sector, you're going to have bigger impacts in the Eastern Cape and Durban South and parts of Pretoria than if we don't. But I think the key, just the anchor point we're trying to get for people here is this idea that a 10 gigaton budget is maximizes economic growth. Going north of that doesn't really help anyone. On the how are we doing question, so we are right in the middle of our 2025 goals. So we're at about, the latest data for 2025 isn't out, but if I were to guess, it's going to be between 420 and 450. So we're in the middle somewhere. We will struggle to get to our 2030 goal, the top end. And so we require much more urgent activity. The only real levers that we had to get below that top end was power sector reform. If Sasol were able to meet their 30% reduction target, and if we did some transition in the automotive sector. And so far, we're not on track to reform we're on track to reform our electricity sector over time, but probably not by 2030. Sasol will struggle to meet their 30% reduction goal by 2030, and we haven't done much on automotives. So we'll be somewhere around the top end. We hope to get in the top end, but we don't know. 5 years' time, maybe there'll be some innovation that comes along that helps us get there. So those are kind of the main challenges. And so sources of alternate fuels, like a new supply of gas, is one area that I don't want to talk on behalf of industry, but that's clearly one area that's a challenge for industry. The pace at which we are building out renewable energy is too slow for us to be able to reliably turn off the coal that we would need, and the ability to purchase EVs and roll out EVs is slower than we had planned. And so those are all things that we can accelerate. Reaching our 2035 goals, however, requires much more participation from more sectors. All right, so you have to continue the pace of decarbonization of some of those heavy industry sectors, but it's going to involve all sectors. To your question about ESG, no. So the NDC will set national level targets. It's up to us as stakeholder groups to then take those targets and think about how we would achieve them through our ESG targets, our internal targets. But of course, it will play out in the sense that the sets need to match the NDC commitment. And therefore, you might have very specific external sectoral goal or a consequent carbon budget. Okay. Yes, we're struggling to move on.
Sorry, just on that comment about the sets need to match the NDC, but earlier you said that the sets inform the NDC. So, and I'm specifically thinking here, say the IRP and the energy sector. How well do those two processes, or can those two speak to each other from a top-down and bottom-up point of view? Because I think that's quite important that they do align, and who's driving who there.
I'm going to practice my diplomacy here and say that they should align. You're right. Yeah. So moving on. We've got, so we're thinking about the 10 gigaton cap, right? But models aren't perfect. Models don't have everything in them. So if we think about the things that are not in the 10 gigaton model, right? Trade impacts, climate impacts, like there's the negative impacts we talked about in the adaptation section, other externalities like air quality, right? And so some studies we did a study with Cambridge Econometrics, we've got a big global trade model, showed that trade impact could wipe out kind of 4 to 5% of GDP by 2030. All right. Climate impacts could wipe out another 5 to 6% by 2030. So we already eroded the differences between those 10 and 9 gigaton on the previous chart, right? Just on those two aspects. Climate change externalities or air quality externalities between the sort of current path and the 9 and 10 gigaton paths, you could have 2,400 fewer people dying early as a result of pollution. And that doesn't factor in things like productivity impacts to the economy. Right. So you could reasonably argue that the 10 gigaton budget is overestimating the economic growth. Right. Lower carbon budgets have other aspects like new value chains, batteries, mining, access to preferential finance is a big factor, and then the upside of trade. And so you could argue that the 9 gigaton budget actually underestimates the economic gains. Right. And so the debate, if we anchor ourselves on 10 and we start to say, well, actually 9 might be more economically beneficial, 8 could be even more economically beneficial, right? And we're starting to kind of establish some reference points for where the top and the bottom end of the range could be. Just as a kind of mental model for how we might think this through. Do you want to add something? You need a mic because otherwise people online can't hear you. Do you guys run out of power? Yeah, it's true. There's no power to the tables. We've got a roving mic which is on its way. Thank you. Sorry, otherwise we exclude the 70 odd people that are online.
Have you taken into consideration health impacts? Because as global temperatures rise and as the temperatures in our regions in particular rise, disease begins to rise.
Exactly.
And that has huge impacts on the economy. So, yeah.
So we haven't to that level of detail. We hope to over time, but even the things that we have taken into account start to erode those GDP differences. But there's more that can be done, and there might be directionality in other ways as well. So one of the things that we want to appeal from you as a business sector is, if you have research that you've done, please do share it with us. We want to be able to understand these impacts really well. But generally, what we find is the directionalities excluded are negative for big GDP and they're positive, for big budgets, and they're positive for smaller budgets. But there are a whole bunch of things that haven't been modeled that could be modeled. Okay, so thinking about equity, what we've been talking about now is best effort, right? What do we think that we can do based on economic modeling and what's affordable and what's feasible, right? So that's best effort. If we think about equity, what is our fair share? This is the carbon budget left for us to stay below 1.5 degrees. 275 gigatons for the planet. And this is well-established science. So if we take a 10 gigaton budget, that's 3.6% of the global share, right? And our economic contribution is about 0.6% to global GDP and about 0.8% of global population. So we would be asking for a share 4 to 5 times bigger than our share today. Does that make sense? Is that fair? Right? And then just to note that gives us a 50% chance of staying below 1.5 degrees. So we're still flipping a coin, right, on some of these big impacts. And so a 10 gigaton budget is about 0.87%, so much more closely aligned to our population of a 2-degree world. So from a best effort thing, we might say, okay, 10 gigaton is the best we can do. Actually, we could probably do 8. Then we're saying we're somewhere between 0.69% and 0.87% of a 2-degree budget with a 50% likelihood. So if everybody thought like us, we would be flipping a coin on 2 degrees. Right, and so there the question is equity. What's fair versus what's best effort, and that should drive us to aim for lower budgets, right? Just as an intellectual framing. Okay, so adaptation is important. We will be committed to some climate change anyway, probably around 2 degrees. And remember that South Africa warms at twice the global average. So we would be somewhere between 4 and 6 on our current trajectory. But those risks are huge. So we should be trying to avoid them. To avoid them, we must mitigate and encourage other countries to mitigate. And our mitigation efforts should be aligned with science and our best efforts. And the bottom end, at least, we will need some support. And what does that support look like? So the UNFCCC language is means of implementation, and there are a whole range of support that we can think about. Finance is the one we all know about. Capacity building, where do we need additional skills? So for example, if local government have to do risk and vulnerability assessments and climate action plans, what kinds of skilling needs do they have? Technology transfer and IP, what tech is available, can we use it without too much friction? And then trade, right? And currently we think about trade as quite punitive. So the measure top of our minds is CBAM. And so one of the questions that we have at the PCC is, can we flip that conversation around to make it a carrot? All right? Can we get a preferential trade agreement on green hydrogen or green iron ore or something that then allows us to reduce the risk in those sectors, particularly where those sectors are strategically important to the economy, like iron and steel. But the key question, right, and to Joanne's earlier point, and to some of the questions in the room and comments in the room, the geopolitical environment is different. We would love $100 billion of grant. You're not going to get it. Right? That's just the reality. And so the core question is, how do we leverage what we can get to maximize domestic investment? Right? Does that make sense? So we have to take the 8.5 billion, which is now sort of just short of 13 billion US dollars in the JET-IP program, and we have to turn that into 1.2 trillion domestic ZAR. Does it make sense? And that's the challenge. And so I worry personally less about the form the money is in, is it debt, is it grants, but more about how are we leveraging it to increase domestic activity. But these are things that we will have to think about in terms of the means of implementation section. And depending on the model you look at, the numbers are quite big. You know, don't look specifically at the models because the scope and thing is different, but we're talking trillions of rand and not hundreds of millions. And so that leverage is important, and the net numbers are also important. And how are we doing so far? And we have about 130 billion of them. This is from work that we've done in tracking climate finance. It's way short of what we need, but there are some positive signs as well. A lot of that investment is coming from domestic sources. Right, so that's good. And so we're leveraging public sector and donor money effectively. Most of that money is in debt. The concerning side is the majority of the investment is in mitigation, and the majority of it is in clean energy. And I mentioned that every sector has to be involved. And we are spending very little on adaptation, despite the risk increasingly getting bigger and more worrying. Okay, so that's the background, right? And we can take a little bit more discussion, and then I'm going to hand over to the commissioners. But really, the theme is flip, we have to worry about climate change. It's really urgent. We have to do something now. Mitigation is our way forward. There are clear options that we can do that are actually positive for the economy and not negative for the economy. Some of them will require support, and we have to think carefully about what that support is. And that support is not just finance. We need to be thinking about some of these other things, in particular trade and capacity building. Please don't forget to introduce yourself. I've been lax in making people introduce themselves.
Good morning, Steve. I'm Kamani from Chikululu Social Investments. And I'm just a question. I don't know if it's a valid question or not. I've heard that there is no such thing as an invalid question.
Yeah.
Where does the most vulnerable feature in the just transition, right? Are the most vulnerable only recipients, or will they also be capacitated to be implementers? I think that's where my question is, and I hope you understand the heart of that question.
Yes. And our general approach to today is we don't have answers to 90% of your questions, but we will try to listen to the heart of your questions and feed that into the recommendations. So the way I would interpret your question is support has to go to local communities and local implementers, and that support isn't necessarily just finance, although it should be finance, because currently they get no finance, but also skills and capacity building and enabling environment. There is some work happening in that space, but I wouldn't be able to enumerate it all for you, but it's a clear need, and we've heard it from other groups as well. Okay, we're going to take one more question, and then I'm going to let the online people who have been waiting patiently come in and provide their views, and then we will take a break. Please go ahead.
Thank you. On the finance, I see that you say most of the money comes from the private sector and it's mostly in debt. Is it imported or locally? Is it the local businesses that are funding?
Yeah.
Or are we getting multinationals to keep us in debt? I just want to understand where the money is coming from and what does the debt mean for our economy? And on the technology transfer and IP, I find that the current regulatory framework does not necessarily support innovation in a way that will be required. I want to understand how much is the DTCI and the DSI, I believe, are involved in ensuring that the regulatory framework is supporting what we want to achieve within the technology transfer and IP.
Mm-hmm. So 2 easy questions for me to answer. I don't know. So the report on climate finance that where the picture was taken from is available on our website, and that goes into detail of like where is the debt coming from. But there is some international debts both through the donor money, but also through international development banks. But my understanding of that is that it's majoritarily domestic debt. So it's renewable energy developers borrowing from mostly commercial banks at this stage. But stand to be corrected. And then on the technology transfer and IP issue, it's a really important point. And you mentioned the DTIC, and I can't speak on their behalf, but this is certainly something that they're interested in. We are working on what's called a technology readiness assessment with them and other partners to try to say, well, what are some of these IP challenges and how can they be overcome? But I don't know a huge amount of the details. But from an NDC perspective, I think one of our lines of feedback could be the technology and IP landscape is not well understood. Right. So there's a communications angle there, and there's a kind of investment and effort angle. So not terribly helpful on those 2 questions, but thank you. Okay, so what we're going to do now is just go into some of the prepared comments by business representatives. And so first up will be Commissioner Princess Takani Nkambula from the Black Business Council, and then we're going to have Commissioner Mzila Mtinjani from the Minerals Council of South Africa, and then we're going to have ex-Commissioner Happy Kambule from Business Unity South Africa, and then we will have comments from Alex McNamara, who's not in the room, but he's never been a commissioner. So that's the plan, and then we'll take a break. Okay. And then when we come back, we will take questions online. And the intention when we come back is to have a proper conversation. So thank you. Commissioner Nkambule, are you online and able to talk?
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you well. Thank you. Please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you so much, Steve. Good morning to everyone, those who've joined online and those who are at Balalaika. Thank you so much to the PCC Secretariat for arranging this meeting. I think from the business point of view, this type of engagements are critical as they ensure that we have a shared understanding in terms of climate change in all its aspects, whether it be mitigation, adaptation, or the implementation, procedural justice. So we really welcome this opportunity to share our views in a transparent manner, to share insights, and also to learn from other stakeholders and other
Can you WhatsApp it? Commissioner, we seem to have lost you. Maybe if you turn your camera off, we might have a better reception. Can you hear us, Commissioner? Okay, I think we've lost her. We'll get our team to give her a call. And if you don't mind, we'll just move on to Commissioner Mtinjane from the Minerals Council. Mzila, are you there?
Yes, I am. A different background since my last webinar. I'll keep it just for efficiency and best use of time available. But just to say thank you very much, Steve, for arranging this and for inviting me to make these comments. And I think just to echo the introductory remarks of Princess Kambule, it's a very important engagement, and it's obviously amongst a series of engagements that have been taking place and will continue to take place. And so I think my comments should really be taken really in the context of today's discussion. And there will be, I'm hoping, that an opportunity to make commentary on the consolidated document, which will include and incorporate, inputs from all other stakeholders. I mean, a lot has been presented today. It's been very educational and insightful in terms of NDCs and where we are as a country. And so I will position my comments at three levels. Firstly, just some light remarks at a global level, from a global context. And then I think more importantly, nationally and regionally, in terms of what I think from what I've heard this morning. And perhaps more importantly, where the mining industry fits in all of this. Joanne did start off with a comment around the global context, which we cannot ignore. It's likely to impact on this very important task and issue on response to climate change. And there's no doubt that, some of the tensions related to geopolitics are related to issues of climate change and, more importantly, technology, which will drive the global response to climate change in terms of how quickly we get to a low carbon future. But I think despite that, the climate agenda will prevail, and I think it will prevail in one form or another. Firstly, if not at a global level, certainly at a regional level, and also at a national level, despite what happens at a global level. And I think in this regard, one of the things that I've kind of landed on is that at the end of the day, climate action is a team sport. There's no one country that can respond to arresting and certainly reversing the effects of climate change. It needs collective action, and it needs this collective action at different levels. At a global level, each country has to make a contribution in order to achieve that target of 1.5 or perhaps maybe 2 degrees, given that 1.5 may be behind us. And there are different countries that have had different degrees of contribution to the causes of climate change. And I think this presents a challenge, particularly for South Africa, despite the statistics that you shared with us, Stephen, that we are amongst the top 20 emitters. What will the action of South Africa alone do to arresting and reversing climate change? I think it's not so much whether our small contribution will make a difference or not, but it's about how we make a difference towards the bigger contribution of arresting climate change. But it does require that we consider our response very carefully as to whether, particularly the points that have been made, by questions from the audience, what does it mean for some of the big countries, big financial and business institutions that seem to be backpedaling to their commitments to various initiatives? Do we then also abandon ship? And what are the likely consequences of that? Or alternatively, do we take this perhaps to say we could be opportunistic in terms of how we respond to our climate action, and what that opportunistic response would be, for instance, if we consider the pace of transition. And I think this is something that could equally impact on the NDC targets and how those NDC targets cascade to the various business sectors. But that would also have trade implications, because I think different countries have started from a different point of departure in response to climate change and will therefore be at different pace to respond to climate change. And so the lag and advances of different countries in trade patterns is going to be an important issue for consideration, because that has a backdraft impact on economic performance. Nationally, I think what is important for me is really the respective and relative roles of business on the one hand, and the role of government on the other, particularly those two institutions, and not necessarily to exclude the role and responsibility of other social partners. And those are roles that need to be considered in today's context in the country of constrained fiscal and economic growth. The social challenges that we are faced with. You did make reference to the historical context that South Africa comes from, the issues that need to be addressed, and we are aiming for higher economic growth, and we do need to address a number of key challenges to achieving that growth. And I think part of that is going to influence on what I personally need to understand better, which is how the NDCs cascade into the various sector targets, such that the industry and the various economic sectors can really have much better clarity on the plans that they can put together in terms of how they contribute to the achievement of the NDCs. We've obviously seen how the mining industry has been at the forefront of investing in renewables. And I'll be the first to admit that was first and foremost a risk response strategy, given the challenges that we've been having with Eskom. And that is typically how business would respond, to issues such as this, that in an attempt to maintain business continuity and business sustainability, how do we navigate the responses and how do we invest in such a way that it enables business continuity? Obviously, the accompanying benefit of that is that with the amount of investment that has taken place in renewables, that has helped in contributing towards less coal-based electricity being used. But as Eskom comes back online, I think we're faced with a very important consideration as to how do we balance energy security through investing in renewables, whilst continuing to maintain our coal fleet and looking at future opportunities, be it in nuclear, but also in technologies like hydrogen. I think it's also worth mentioning something that I didn't hear you talk about, a regional perspective. And here, South Africa remains a very important and strong economic player, not only in SADC, but also in the African continent. And I don't know what the thinking is in terms of a coordinated thinking and approach and perspective on how our actions or lag in action towards climate change will impact on the region. So with that global and national context, perhaps I can now come to the mining industry. I think it's a very interesting sector to be in this day and age, because it plays both the role of enabler and driver of climate response action. And the way that I see it is that from a driver, you would have seen, as I mentioned earlier, how the industry has responded to both Scope 1 and particularly Scope 2 emissions, and Scope 3 a little bit more complex. And so it's been slow in terms of this sector or any business responding to that. And as a driver, it is really a domestic action that the mining industry is playing, and it will continue to make its contribution where that is required, both for its own sustainability, but I think more importantly in terms of how it can contribute to the reduction of emissions, given that it's an industry which is a member of the energy intensive user group. It is also a key enabler. We've been involved in work with the DMPR around the defining of South Africa's critical mineral strategy. And I think you'll all appreciate how the debate so far on critical minerals has been shaped and defined by the so-called global north, given their economic outlook, their technology progress, and I guess what we also see, ambition for military supremacy has and the potential impact on the supply of these minerals to be able to achieve that outlook. In the definition of what is critical for South Africa, we have had to consider two things. I think in the first instance, it's the role of mining for reasons of development of the country, the region, and particularly and broadly speaking, the continent. And why this was important was that we felt that it's an important starting point and point of departure to be able to transition in a way that is just, effective, and efficient. And I think this point goes back to some of the points I made earlier around an important consideration in all the work that is being done in as far as the point from which South Africa and the African region and the global South is starting on this journey of just transition and setting targets, that the targets we're setting do not put us under due stress, resulting possibly in sacrificing, a large part of our population in order to achieve a target which it appears so many others are abandoning. The second part is that, and this is something that I also mentioned earlier, how do we also transition in a way that I think also puts our best interest as a country and a region first, but we remain committed to the long-term goal of achieving a low-carbon future. We are a country that is constrained by many factors, both historical and current, which we are addressing. But the mining industry, certainly from where I'm sitting, is one which can play a very important role, both in terms of how it enables the development of the country, but also in terms of the production of those minerals that will supply the technologies that will enable us to transition. But for that to happen, and as I conclude, it is important that we get clarity and urgency of the action plan. And I think here, first and foremost, something that we've always been advocating for is an enabling legislation that really provides for a mining industry to thrive. And this is part of our work and our reason for existence as a Minerals Council, that we believe we're here to co-create with government, with other social partners, an environment that will enable the mining industry to grow and to thrive. Given the current conversation on critical minerals, we believe that South Africa has a very important role to play. It has the world's leading reserves on some of these critical minerals like PGMs, which will be important for hydrogen, manganese for battery storage, as well as vanadium, chrome, which is going to be important in terms of infrastructure. And so South Africa will continue to be a major player in the mining industry, but also in the global economy and the transition of the world towards a low carbon sector. With that, I think it will also be important to really begin to communicate, the carbon budget or the sector targets, because this allows for better and more effective planning. And it allows for that duality of planning, both in terms of investment in mining, but also how this is contributing to reduction of emissions. And I think the two come together in terms of how we then adapt to a changing environment, both from a climate perspective, but also an economic growth, given the regional impact of the country. And we should, with that, and hopefully begin to see, finance and investment in mining. Would like to see partnerships in terms of the just transition, including everything else that needs to be considered in as far as the just transition is concerned, and taking on board, adaptation principles. But this can only happen in an industry that is performing and that is growing. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Some very important messages there about the role of business in the context of global change and partnerships in delivering across adaptation, just transition. So just to your earlier point about having the opportunity to feed into the PCC recommendations. Well, obviously you will have a particular role as a commissioner, but the process that we'll be running, as I mentioned, is we've done capacity building workshops. These are workshops where we want to hear from you. We're taking very careful notes. We will then draft a set of recommendations. We will host a colloquium where we get all of us back together, and we will give you the opportunity to publicly comment on the recommendations that we make. We will produce 3 reports. We will produce the recommendations report, which needs to be short and sharp. The president doesn't have time to read 100-page reports. This will be backed by a technical report, which will be probably 100 pages. And then we also will produce a stakeholder report where we will faithfully record all of the things that you've said. And that will influence the PCC's broader program. So not everything that is said can be reasonably incorporated into the NDC process or the NDC recommendations, but everything is important, and so we will kind of build that into our broader program. So thank you, Commissioner, for that input. Can we try Commissioner Tsakane again? Commissioner, are you back online?
I'm back online, Steve. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Please go ahead.
Yeah, my apologies. I think there was load shedding, so I had to switch to another gadget. I think we need to ask ourselves, what does the future look like? As a country, what are our aspirations? What are we doing? And what do we want from international partners. I think the last one, Steve, we have responded to that. We are not at liberty to demand or maybe to request what we think is fair, what we think would assist with adaptation, as we are all aware that the grant portion is very small. We need to ask our question as we are taking on debt, which we have to take because there's no turning back. We have to transition as a country. We know the negative impact of not transitioning. Those have been clearly communicated. Steve and others, they've done their best to ensure that our targets are backed by science. So, but we need to ask ourselves, the international funding, just to start with the last one that I mentioned, we need it. We know the number, it's debt. But then we have a situation as a country where SOEs, municipalities also need to transition. And what we know is the country cannot afford, because the partners need a sovereign guarantee. And the country at the moment cannot afford to guarantee all institutions. So as business, what is our approach? Our approach in business is that the approach has to be measured. We cannot transition at a pace that we cannot afford as a country. Countries transition at different paces, as you are aware that the developed countries, they are years ahead of us. Also because maybe they started before us, but also they use their own fiscus to transition. We, in order to transition, we do not have our own fiscus to use. So whether we'll be able to repay, I don't think that's an issue. Because we don't have an option out, and we're all aware that the negative impact of climate change disproportionately affected the disadvantaged. We've seen there are many examples of devastating effects of not transitioning. But we also need to ask a question. If we transition at a pace that we cannot afford as a country, it will impact business negatively, and that will also affect the growth of our economy. And we are all aware that we're not doing too great there. So how do we balance this? We have all seen the effect of poverty because we're ill prepared. But as PCC, we've learned from that. We tend to correct that. Whether we have enough time to ensure that transition, there's preparation before you transition. And we are all aware that in the first world, developed countries, the planning is about 10 years or more. We are now looking at about 6 years, which obviously a big mistake with Komati because we didn't learn from other countries. There's no country that transitioned within a year or two, but it's a lesson that we've learned. So if you look at the original schedule, original schedule of decommissioning, it was not realistic. So we're just chasing those targets without actually looking at the impact of that transition. Because if we do not prepare alternative an economy, what do we hope for? Because people will lose jobs, is very clear. And SMEs, big business as well. I mean, even now when you look at ESCOM, we need, so not ESCOM, SASO. That's a good example. So big business will lose out, but also your SMEs, who some of them are reliant on big business. In Komati, the loss was not just on, okay, jobs were not lost because jobs were, people were just displaced to other mines, but all your small contractors lost their livelihood. So we as Black Business Council, we support that ESCOM's decommissioning schedule cannot be rushed because we need to reach targets. We have to ensure that as they decommission the next one, has there been adequate preparation for that? As much as we say that when you transition, there'll be new business opportunities like your batteries, but we need to face the fact that people who lose jobs, I don't think we've got a big enough social net to absorb them. So it's our homework, you know, we have to face it. Say, okay, how do we, yes, there are alternative industry, but some of those industries, we're not even sure if they're going to work. But I think as the PPC, we're doing well with the employment strategy to ensure that we work, you know, alongside ESCOM power stations, especially in Mpumalanga and I think in Limpopo. So I always fall back on what the OECD says in terms of climate change. One, climate change will ensure that there's energy security. We cannot afford, because if I think about Komati for us, for Komati to go back to that 1,200 megawatts is going to take, I think, almost 8 to 10 years. Then how do you close the gap in terms of energy security, affordability? I think in the short term, affordability will be a problem, but obviously in the medium to long term, affordability will be, I mean, will be fine. But if your businesses, including your communities, cannot afford energy, it's a serious challenge. We are aware also that in those countries that have developed much faster than us, who are leading, who are the front runners, the issue of affordability is real. Affordability of energy is real. So we need to be thinking about that. We need to learn from those. We cannot just say, okay, this is what's happening to South Africa, and I'm confident that Steve and them and I haven't seen that comparison, you know, with the other countries. You know, just shows that affordability will be a problem, or there'll be energy security. So we need to get to that level where we say, look, we have to transition at all costs, but let it be a measured approach, because we have seen countries which transition faster having issues with maybe either energy security or affordability. How do we mitigate that as South Africa? The third thing, obviously, the reduction of emissions. So it's energy security, affordability, and reduction of emissions. You know, China, it's at an advantage, and I suppose that's the strategy of the whole country, because we are aware that they are building power stations every week, right? And then when you ask why are they building power stations, they say no, they have to do that to grow their economy. But we need to grow our economy as well. Well, they are smart because at the same time they've got an aggressive program of renewables. So I'm just saying, as a country, what is our strategy? Yes, we are decommissioning, and we've got a target. But I think as business, as we're saying, that we've learned that at times we cannot sacrifice everything else because we've got targets. I always say that we need a balance, because are we saying that you either die of hunger or you die of emissions? If you ask the ordinary person, yes, I think they are vaguely aware that emissions can lead to death. But we must also be aware that they are concerned, when we go to these communities during our stakeholder engagement, their concern is, I hear you, we can see everyone can see the devastating effects of climate change, but their concern will be, what am I going to eat? If I lose my job, I lose my livelihood. So it's something that I think as PCC we are working on. And the same thing with businesses. Where businesses say, I've lost my contract. I don't have anything. So should I die of hunger? And people say, okay, I'd rather die of emission. But I'm just saying it's something that we must be aware that the communities, that is their thinking. So when we come up with our approach, we need to take that into consideration, because for them a just transition also means that they should not be left worse off. So I think I just want to check. I think those were my comments. So I think in summary, enterprise development has to be part of climate change. The businesses, especially small businesses, need capacity building. They need to be reskilled for the new economy. They also we need to ensure that as we when we look at new technologies, whether it's brought in by our own private sector or from outside, we'll have to make sure that your SMMEs as well, who employ about 60% of people in South Africa, we have to ensure that they are part of that. They are not left behind, because if we're going to leave that behind, we'll even have an issue with social cohesion. So I think my last point, Steve, when we look at the automotive industry, the fact of the matter is, at the moment, we cannot afford it as a country, because the industry will tell you that we cannot afford on our own to change our production line. The price, it has been done, they've done the research, the price of a vehicle will be 4 times much higher. And the country, we are aware with our current debt to GDP ratio, the fiscus is severely constrained. So I think we are in an agreement, most of us, that what is realistic is to look at public transport, and obviously get the people, make sure that we find a way of getting people out of their cars. So the automotive industry is something that is work in progress. But on the fossil fuels, already we have started. What we need is just to make sure that the strategy that we are adopting as a country, it's good for the country, and as we transition, we will ensure that our economy grows as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Commissioner. Yeah, some very important points there. Key concern that you can transition too fast as well as transitioning too slow. And so we're trying to find this really difficult balance. And I think the points about economic diversification, social support, skills development, governance that run alongside that transition are equally important. And require us to contemplate when we're thinking about these national level plans. So yeah, thank you for that input, Commissioner. We're going to jump next to Mr. Alex McNamara from the National Business Initiative, who's going to give us an input from the NBI. Thank you, Alex.
Good morning, everybody. Hopefully you can hear me. Alex McNamara, the Head of Environment at the National Business Initiative. Okay. So as thinking about the session and I was preparing for it, I was thinking, I wonder if I could take a slightly different approach and maybe even put this in a bit of historical context, because I've been working in the sector for quite a while now. So I decided to do that and to think in a way about a few kind of historical false dawns that we had, specifically, I think, in the energy sector. And then I'll paint the picture to the NDC thereafter. So when I did my honours thesis in 2004, it was about how we were going to have load shedding in 2008 because we simply were not ready for, we were not capitalizing our new coal-fired power stations. And of course, we all know 2008 was the beginning of load shedding, right? And so how did we respond? I think we galvanized around energy efficiency, which was the core thing I was saying in my honours thesis. Like, if we could just do energy efficiency, we will make massive change. And we did that. I think the reorienting of our economy around energy efficiency was fantastic out of 2008. So we learned a lesson there, and I think we became a lot more competitive with the real world where electricity prices increased substantially and electricity is a finite resource. And then, but that was one aspect. Then we finally, of course, announced the renewable energy bidding program we kicked off in 2011, global award-winning program, some quite large-scale investment. And then we faltered, right? Then we halted the program, and there are all kinds of consequences that I think could be argued that came out of that process. We've recently done some interviews with a number of OEMs and various companies involved in the value chain of renewable energy. And it's quite clear that certain companies were sort of ramping up to provide more local content and manufacturing and assembly of renewable energy in our country as that program expanded, but then that was cut short. So a whole bunch of potential downstream economic opportunities basically started to waver in that period at that point in time. And it was a kind of an example where we had significant domestic and international investment, and then we kind of pulled back. And of course, we all know that one of the implications of not building significant renewable energy at scale, because of course it's fast, it can be brought in quite quickly, was the significant load shedding we had in 2022, 2023. We all don't need to be reminded of it. What was the positive outcome of that? We created the rooftop solar business, right? In many ways, great. So there are a whole bunch of people who were able to enter that space. That's the elite. That's people, us in this room benefiting. So yes, there were certain small SMEs that were encouraged or grew as a result of that, but it was really the elites who were able to support themselves, and obviously businesses were able to run their operations more commercially viably. The effect on municipal indebtedness would only have increased, right? This didn't support communities and average low-income households. If anything, it put strain on municipal services, right? So an opportunity was created, but it didn't address the systemic challenges we have in the country. So if I think now about the NDC and a more ambitious NDC, I feel like we've had, in a way, two false dawns. One, we had, as we were preparing for the first wave of load shedding, which policymakers knew were going to come eventually if we didn't invest. And then we had the halting of the bidding program, the renewables program, which was obviously has been reinvigorated now. But as we know, the pace of renewable energy rollout is not at sufficient scale or acceleration at present in the country. We also know that renewable energy is the least cost electricity in the country and has many, many other multiplier effects, as has been intimated throughout this work. The NBI released a report about a year ago or 2 years ago, which basically says it all hinges on renewables. Our ability to support local content and support downstream economic development, our ability to ensure energy security, our ability to deal with water and air quality related impacts, as we've already discussed as well. So for me, the NDC is an opportunity to really embed significant renewable energy ambition in the NDC. And why is that important? It's because I don't think personally that we can afford another false dawn in this particular area. There are older power stations that will be decommissioned over time. At whatever pace we agree, we will need to replace that. If we don't, for example, have an ambitious renewable energy target of say 6 to 7 gigawatts per annum in the NDC, I think we have to use every available opportunity to get it right this third time. So this is our third opportunity to really, really scale renewable energy and take full advantage of it. And of course, the power sector is only the beginning, and we know we have to obviously resolve for transmission. We all understand that. But as you know, if we sort out renewable energy successfully, we can then, of course, then apply it into the electric vehicle space and into transport. And then hopefully, as they become more commercially viable, things like green steel and green hydrogen. I just want to also remind everybody that our single biggest import is crude and petroleum and refined petroleum, $20 billion per annum, or about 360 billion rand per year. So as I just think maybe we should just zoom out a little bit, because we obviously focus on the facts and the figures intently and for a reason. But there is an economic trend that is occurring here. If we can scale renewable energy, the global companies will want to invest in local assembly and manufacturing because it will make business sense for them to do so. Never mind all the downstream jobs we can achieve in the circular economy of renewable energy components, the value chain of transmission networks, etc. At the same time, we can significantly impact our balance of payments. We struggle with our balance of payments already. We have concerns about our debt ratio. If we can really downscale our crude and refined petroleum product imports, we can have a significant economic benefit. All at the same time, while actually the cost of inaction only grow annually. So I know there's very real concern about the difficulty of new economic pathways, about new economic development. We all understand that. But every day we sit in the current status quo, the rest of the world is moving. The market has moved. Renewable energy is the cheapest source of energy in the world today. Investment in fossil fuels is now less than investment in clean energy. And as we've seen in countless other times, nobody really beats the market. I'll give you a good example. George W. Bush Jr., this relates closely to the current geopolitics of today, thought that he could beat the market when it came to the automotive sector, and did everything he could as the president of the United States to prevent fuel efficiency standards from pushing through in the American automotive sector. He wanted to make sure that there was that was the last thing that he wanted to achieve. But the market was moving to fuel efficiency, and at that stage to hybrid vehicles. What was the net result? America, as one of the automotive sector heartlands of the world, moved into decline. So much so that President Obama had to bail out General Motors, the once great General Motors, to deal with that economic decline over time. You can't beat the market, and the market will move inexorably due to pricing, to clean energy, clean tech, AI, whatever the new economy. So the assumption that we can't move or shouldn't move, I think we have to let go of. Then finally, there's the big argument about one, it seems to, I mean, there is a significant economic rationale and for our competitiveness and energy security to embrace renewable energy at scale and use whatever policy lever we can, including the NDC. But then, of course, there's also the secondary factor that, as we all know, we are a taker of climate impacts. We do not want to be in a 3-degree or even 2-degree warming world. I think, as mentioned previously, we do quite a bit of work in KZN. As we know, the effects of just existing climatic impacts are so severe on our economy. We can't afford that. I mean, if we just look at the day zero drought in Cape Town and the Western Cape, the city of Cape Town is pumping 20 billion rand into water infrastructure to try and prevent a future day zero. There's probably very few municipalities in this country that can afford that. Most cannot even contemplate that. And that is in current state. So if we combine on the one side, the economic opportunity and the cost of inaction, and on the other hand, we combine the climate impacts, which are effectively, some of which are already baked in, and the worst effects we have to avoid, it is in our best interest to put forward an ambitious NDC, because we need a society where global warming or climate change is as low as possible. Every percentage reduction will support us. There's a lot of no regrets, particularly in the early phases for us, if we embrace renewable energy as a kind of our fulcrum and our focus point, and then we build from there. I think the alternative doesn't seem very attractive. We failed to invest in renewables at scale. We will then have a next phase of load shedding occurring. We will not have local content. We will then feel the effects of climate change on top of that. It's not a positive scenario. So certainly as the NBI, we believe that an ambitious competitive economy is achievable, that renewable energy will be the driving force of this, and it is in our social interest and our economic interest to do so. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. A couple of important points there. The suggestion in this debate and this conversation about you can go too fast and you can go too slow, that the evidence is firmly in the direction of we need to move faster rather than slower. But also this important point that I actually wanted to pick up earlier, the way that the Paris Agreement is phrased leads us to think that if we miss 1.5 degrees, we must aim for 2 degrees. But the Paris Agreement actually says well below 2 degrees. But also every 1/10 of a degree counts, to what Alex just said. So if we miss 1.5 degrees, then we should be going for 1.55 degrees, and then 1.6, and then 1.65 degrees, right? And so we shouldn't default to this idea that, oh, we've missed 1.5 degrees, well, now we're going to hit 2 degrees. You've got to go for every little step. So some very important inputs there. Thank you, Alex. So our last speaker, representing the sort of official representative of business, BUSA, is Mr. Happy Kambule. And so we invite you to take the stage. Thank you.
All right. Good morning, everyone. And thank you, Steve. Thank you to the PCC for the invite. It's a lot of information, right? But we do know a couple of things. And before I get into my prepared response, I think I wanted to touch on a couple of things. The first thing is we can't backtrack. That's a clear argument that we cannot go backwards on what we've committed. In fact, we should be moving forward. What that looks like, we can still argue, of course, but what we need to communicate to the world is that as much as the geopolitics are moving in a particular direction, countries are reneging on some of their commitments, they will come back. They did come back. It's not the first time. The last time this situation occurred, well, let me say the first time this situation occurred, the Kyoto Protocol was at risk. It continued on, and there were some emission reductions that were achieved by the developed countries. Then the United States came back, and then we had the Paris Agreement. One of the main reasons why we have the Paris Agreement was, yes, to fix the kinks of the Kyoto Protocol, but also is to welcome the United States back into the fold and also make developing countries able to give emission reduction and targets. So we cannot backtrack, but we can adjust our commitment. And I think that's something that we need to talk about a little bit more deeply. Our fair share from the current NDC has been recognized as a credible, legitimate fair share. And that's what Steve was talking about when he showed us some of the emission reduction points or maybe targets, depending on how we break up our peak plateau and decline trajectory. And although we don't call it that, but it's still the same. But what we don't know is where we come from. And we can't have a situation where we're making commitments without learning where exactly we come from. And we come from a world where we had emissions on a business as usual trajectory, which was taking us towards 6 degrees, 4 degrees, as Steve has said. So the current NDC, when it is communicated, it needs to also give us a historical context to show the action that is occurring. It's not like we're not doing anything. There's a lot that's happening in the country. The second part, which I think should be responded to, is the reason why this is important for all of us is that there's going to be capital investment that is required from each and every business, particularly those that are liable for the carbon budgets and those that are earmarked for sectoral initiatives under the sets. And the NDC is that lever that gives us that indication. I don't think, and I think that conversation was occurring, that they align. There is a bit of an overshoot on the sectoral part because of the way that they are designed. But what we don't have is that we have a lot of reliance on the private sector to do a lot of action, but we do not have a recourse when the public sector does not act. And that brings down confidence as to say that maybe in 2 years' time, they might decide, well, we're going to hold off on the renewable energy project or on the hydrogen drive. So we need to have a complementary was about to get into tongue twister there, a complementary set of obligations and commitments that are coming from the public sector. So if you do not produce under the Climate Change Act that particular plan as a municipality or local government, there should be a recourse. Just as much as there's a recourse for a company when it does not produce or does not comply with the carbon budget as per the carbon tax liability. So those are things that can create the confidence to say that we are actually moving in the same direction. But right now there's an over-reliance on the business sector to act on this. The second component on that is that there's capital investment, human resources, and other investments that will need to be done, but none of those are actually being incentivized. So we need a set of incentives, subsidies, and allowances that would allow for that. We cannot just rely on the carbon tax alone. Additional to that, all of you will be facing, and everyone in South Africa is facing, particularly in the private sector, enhanced transparency frameworks, disclosures that require you to actually have a certain number of data sets, but also an investment in your company operations. That's an increase in cost of business, but that's also an increase on just the level of work that needs to be done. So we need to be able to address that, at least in terms of saying that the transparency requirements that are going to be apportioned on any other company, business, or organization needs to be in line with the others that are emerging, such as those in biodiversity and land use, in order to make sure that we don't have an administrative burden. And then I think in my opening remarks to end, I would like to say that the issue here is that the private sector, when given the opportunity, moves quite quickly. We know that in terms of investment into renewable energy as a result of Schedule 2 uncapping of the limitations on embedded generation, we saw what that meant. We saw what it meant when we got a signal that the ERA is going to be signed into law, and it gave us an indication that actually the private sector's got a lot of capacity to move. But the problem that we're sitting with are those barriers. One of those barriers is the fact that we do not have a complementary regulatory framework that enforces and holds compliance to public sector. The second one is physical infrastructure like the transmission grid. And then the last one is when we have gatekeeping by market dominant players, but traditionally in the public sector, not to allow access. And that's, for example, I will not go far, is issues related to grid access, but I think those will be resolved in the near term. But directly on the NDCs, I think the perspective we need to take is that an ambitious NDC is important so that we can communicate to the international world that we're still in this. Regardless of whatever happens in the United States, in Argentina, we are still in this because we are living in a world, and we are in a particular model of the world where we are price takers in many of the sectors that we're in. And secondly, we are reliant on many of the traditional trade partners, and they have got certain rules that are going to enable them in order to meet their own NDC targets. For years, we've been worried that the IPCC is just looking at emissions from a production point of view. Countries, some parties within the UNFCCC are saying that they're going to look at it from a consumption point of view. We've always wanted that, but the rules that are pertaining to how they're going to actually account for emissions that are going to be consumed and how they're going to put pricing on that, we've got a problem with, obviously. So we are in negotiations as to try to address that. But this is a result of a country making its own decision, or a region making its own decisions in order to ensure that the products that they're bringing in are going to be of a particular quality, and they're going to meet the standards which they are also enforcing on that particular private sector or the sectors in their economy. And unfortunately, we have to work with that. And it's not only the EU and the UK that are looking at this. Before the United States changed administration, there were indications of that. Canada indicated that it's going in that direction. Even with the current administration in the United States, we know that there are tariffs that are going to be imposed. There might not be carbon border adjustment under carbon, but the border adjustments under different areas. And we need to be alive to that. Japan has also indicated that it's going in that direction, and many other developed countries are going in that direction. So we do not have any other way other than to actually drive down our emissions. So we need to make this commitment as clear as possible. But obviously, making this commitment needs to be balanced with a number of potential impacts. And part of this impact is that we do not have a just transition if we are not transitioning. There will be no way to say that we're going to be sharing in ownership, transforming the economy, and ensuring that no one is left behind if we're not moving in any particular direction. And this process of having a stop-start is the thing that is creating uncertainty. So we're going to be looking to the policymakers to ensure that we've got that commitment, that we're moving in a particular direction. Now, the South African case is quite unique. The NDC, as I indicated, has been taken in the context that it is credible, not the new one, because we don't know what it's going to look like. We've got kind of a sense what it might look like from what Steve has presented. But we also have to recognize that it has to be done in a balanced and a responsible way. This can be achieved in a number of ways. And I think the main thing here is that we need to be looking at pathways to achieving the net zero target, but also the particular target for 2035. The first thing is we've got financial pathways that need to be unlocked, as well as transition pathways that need to be unlocked. If we get a sense of that, I think it will make it easier for us to be able to say, let's have better confidence on trajectory A or trajectory B. Added to that, what we would look at is to ensure that the pathways, they break down, at least to the extent, the unique socio-economic challenges that we're facing in South Africa. Additional to that is that on adaptation, there is a need to define a national adaptation goal with specific metrics and indicators, and also indicate areas where the private sector can play a pivotal role by exploring investment opportunities in some of the interventions that are provided. A lot of times, adaptation, as you've seen, has taken a secondary step, but we do know that if we do not adapt, we're going to be stuck in a situation where the climate risks are just going to be overwhelming. We'll have uninsurable assets, and we will start to clog up some of our supply chains, primarily in areas where we were wanting to build big infrastructure, like in Durban and KZN region, or the East Coast more broadly. Moreover, the NDC should address the technology and capacity gaps needs of the country. The private sector is well positioned to contribute to meeting South Africa's technology needs, provided there is a clear framework for investment in technical capacity building. This includes identifying the requisite resources needed to close the gaps and promoting private sector involvement in technology transfer and innovation. It is important for the NDC to indicate a clear comparison, as I indicated, of a business as usual emissions trajectory. And if we're not talking about a business as usual trajectory, we're talking about the current trajectory that we've had, including the historical one, maybe from 2000 or 2005, in order to give us a sense of how far we've come. And this will enable us, including especially as the private sector and social partners, to gauge as how far we've come as a country. But more importantly, it will indicate the areas where there is potential for mass potential for mass economic and emission reductions that we would need to undertake. But I think what is the most important piece here is that we need to balance the socio-economic challenges that we're facing, an economy that is stagnant, that is also slowing in some respect. The recovery is starting to show, but it's not at the rate that we need. And also largely ensuring that we've got competitiveness, not only domestically, but also internationally. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Happy. Some really important points there. The NDC, an ambitious NDC is important. We are still in this. I think what's a very important rallying cry, echoing what Alex was saying around this kind of stop, start is not helpful to anyone, but also making the point that the NDC must be balanced and be thinking about socioeconomic impacts, the pace, affordability of the change. Adaptation needs to be included. We need the clear focus on adaptation, and then this kind of comparison against what we've done. Similar to the global stock take, we as South Africa have done important changes and made important gains, and we need to think about the NDC both in that context, but also in the socioeconomic, political context of the country. So all really important inputs. I'm sure that you're all now exhausted and probably needing the loo, and so I'm going to call for a short break. And if it's okay, if we can only break for 15 minutes, I know we scheduled half an hour, but we want to get back and get you talking to us. So if we can break until 12:45, and then come back and we'll do some exercises. There are a couple of questions and comments online that we've neglected that need to come in. And then Joanne Yarwich can also come in and talk to some of the questions that we asked about social investment and some of that background. So thank you everybody for your participation so far. It's been fascinating from our side, from a PCC perspective. I've already got 3 or 4 pages of notes here. So thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you in 15 minutes. Thanks everybody. Okay. All right, if we can make our way back, please, everybody. It's good to see some discussion happening. Hopefully talking about NDCs and not the cricket, but let's see. Okay. Just want to wait for people to come in from outside a little bit. Okay, in this next section, we're going to do a couple of things. We're going to continue the conversation. We want to hear more from you, in particular, the people online who've been waiting very patiently. And also, if Joanne is still online, she can make a quick comment on some of the questions that were asked in the first round on social investment. And then we're going to do an exercise with the post-it notes that are hopefully on your table or will shortly be arriving at your table. So Joanne, I wonder if you're
Steve,
online. Yeah.
Yeah, I am. Okay, should I come in?
Yes, please, go ahead.
Okay. There've been a whole lot of comments made around the jet, and I thought it might be useful to do three things. The first is to talk a little bit about how the jet package links to the NDC. The second is to talk a little bit about the US and where we are, so the status of it. And then the third is to talk about, in particular, the grant and concessional elements of this package and how they are being used. Okay, so I think that importantly, the achievement and what we do to try and get into the NDC range and as far down the NDC range as possible is at the heart of the agreement that South Africa signed with the International Partners Group. In the last week, the US has pulled out of the partnership. However, the vast bulk of their money, $1 billion, is commercial debt and equity. And thus far, in fact, it has funded a number of big projects, big commercial projects, some of them in the critical minerals value chain. That money doesn't go back. Their grant element was the smallest of all of the grant elements in the package. So I think that that is important. We've had very clear indications from all of the other partners that they intend to walk the long road with South Africa, and they are 100% in with the partnership, which I think is also important. Just to say, I mean, there's been a number of people have referred to the fact that a large part of this package is debt. That is true. But it is important to understand that the majority of that debt is very cheap debt. And it is concessional debt, and it is cheaper than what certainly National Treasury can obtain on the market. And so it has become very attractive money, for example, to support climate-linked policy loans, as well as investments. A number of the international investment banks are looking at investing into Transnet, for example, in order to support the work around solving the logistic crisis. There are grant elements that go along with that. There's also still an intention, I think, a very strong interest in supporting the transmission rollout. And then through the private sector elements of that package, supporting many of the IPPs and generation. So I think that in relation to the country's need for both FDI and Forex, it becomes quite important. Just on the grant element in this whole package is around, was before the US pulled out, it's now about 14.9 billion rand. It is a significant amount of money. About half of that has been programmed. There is still half of that will be deployed over the next few years. Our concern has been that the bulk of that money has gone into three categories of spend. Firstly, technical assistance. Secondly, capacity building. Thirdly, research. And in actual fact, very little of that money has flowed to communities, to workers, and to SMMEs on the ground. And so we've worked very hard to look at what can be done around that. And we have set up a funding platform. And that platform is a matchmaking facility that tries to support the development of just transition projects from communities, workers, women's group, church groups, municipalities, and SMMEs. and try to support them to build those projects so it becomes easier to fund them with grant funding. And we are looking for partners in relation to that work, including, I think importantly, partners who are sitting in this room and the corporate sector more broadly, to look at how could we leverage, aggregate, and make a better impact out of the corporate CSI, enterprise development, skills development spend that the corporate sector invests. And there are a number of programs around that, but it is something that is very important. So just to, I think, Steve, to give that as an input, and to say that we are actively now looking at mobilizing additional international finance from a far broader set of sources than was at the beginning of the package. So looking in particular at the development finance institutions internationally, not only from the West, but looking in particular at building South-South relationships. We are looking at ways that we can support the infrastructure development initiatives that are being rolled out across the board. And I think it's quite important that there's an ongoing engagement with business in that regard, and an engagement that happens at a suitably early stage. On the decommissioning, there is a very big program, $2.5 billion of this package, some of which is grant, some of $50 million of which is grant, $450 million, which is highly concessional loan finance, almost free money in many ways, and leveraged by both contributions from the multilateral development banks, as well as the private sector that is supporting Eskom's decommissioning plan. And I think important to say, given the comments that have been made, is that Eskom took a decision to delay the decommissioning of the next 3 plants that will reach the end of their economic and operational life to 2030. And so the plan has been adjusted to take that into account. And I think it really is important in the context of this that there is, I think, a sober reflection on what makes sense for the country. And it's very important in terms of an understanding of what it means to lead this process and not be pulled along by it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Joanne. That was very helpful and addressed some of the earlier questions. And I think also points to, which is a theme that's come up in all of the consultations, is what is this sector's agency? And there are things that you can do through CSI funding, but also through partnerships and innovation. And so that if, we all make this a kind of collective goal. So thank you, Joanne. So in terms of the way forward, there are Post-it notes on your table. And to those online, a link will be dropped in the chat, which will give you access to an online equivalent. And what we're asking you to do is, as you think of ideas, to write them on the Post-it notes and stick them up on the various whiteboards around the room. And we have a couple of questions to help guide you. The first one is, what are you worried about? Right, just simply, like, what concerns you? If we're moving too fast, if we're moving too slow, what should we be thinking about in terms of how we structure the NDC? And so you can put them on the back left-hand board there. I can't actually read them from here, so I'm guessing. So you can put it on the back left board. And even as we think, if you come up with an idea, just write it down and stick it on there. And those of you that are online can do the same. I think we had like 200 Post-it notes online yesterday. So let's see if you can top that. And then in the back there, we are asking, what are the principles that we should be thinking about across adaptation, mitigation, justice, and means of implementation? Like, what are the high-level principles that we should be using in setting up an NDC? And then on the last board in the right-hand corner here, my right-hand corner, is what kind of priority actions or targets should we be taking or setting? Right, and again, across justice, adaptation, mitigation, and means of implementation. And so, yeah, if you have ideas, later on when you have lunch, we will be checking to see if you put a Post-it note on the board. And those that do not can only have one course. Okay, so yeah, please do that for us. And again, online, please feel free to just populate that post-it note board as much as you would like. But obviously, we're also here to hear from you. And so we're going to go online because they patiently missed out on the first session. So Zamasa, I don't know if you can queue up the online people for us. Sorry? Okay. Okay, great. Commissioner Nordia is online and would like to make a comment. Louise, do you want to come in?
No, Commissioner Nordia does not want to make a comment.
Okay.
But I'll say this then, seeing as now I'm online.
We've given you the floor.
I'm here to listen, because and learn from everyone in the room. But I must say that I was quite encouraged by the remarks from Busa and from NBI, which is, really forward thinking compared to what we might have heard from Busa in the past. Thank you.
Thank you. Samasa? Okay. Gina, do you want to go? And please also just introduce yourself and where you're from.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Gina Downs. I'm a corporate specialist at Eskom in climate change issues. I just posted something in the chat. I've been asked to voice it over. There's been a lot of discussion about the international factors that are affecting the rate of this transition. And I wanted to raise the one about municipal debt. It doesn't matter to me if a loan is a low-cost loan, that's great, but you still have to pay it back. And if you are going to be borrowing money to supply electricity, then you have to get an income from that to pay back your loan. So I wondered if the PCC had any views or advice on how to redress this decision of non-payment by certain sectors. Whether they had influence in other rooms to encourage action by municipalities and by individuals in that regard, or if they thought it was a question of affordability, if that in itself didn't say that we had to go and revisit the economic models, which say how much can we afford to borrow, and therefore how much can we afford to build, and therefore how quickly can we transform. Thanks.
Thanks. And then Marcia? Marcia, do you want to go ahead?
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Excellent. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity, Steve. And thank you for the interesting conversation. Really appreciate all the points. A lot of what I wanted to raise was already posed by other speakers. But I wanted to just bring a little bit of the perspective from the iron and steel industry. We know that it is a material that will be critical also to enable the low carbon transition in South Africa, not always in terms of infrastructure, but also to manufacture other low carbon technologies in the country. You brought brought the point of the voluntary commitments that we have been doing as a country. Since 2009, I would like to bring the Copenhagen Accord, where we committed to 34% reduction by 2020 and 42% reduction by 2025. And it's important to mention that that was conditional on the availability of funding to be available to technology transfer and capacity building. Just to give you a perspective, in the last 20 years, the iron and steel industry has reduced 50% of greenhouse gas emissions, considering scope 1 and scope 2 absolute emissions. And unfortunately, this is not due to technology availability or any funding. This is due to global and local depression, economic depression, low steel demand, high imports in the country, and plant closures. So We as a hard-to-abate industry, we have challenges with people involved will understand very well. We need technology to be developed and to be successful at industrial scale. These technologies are extremely expensive. And Joanne, sorry to your point, there is not such a cheap debt for decarbonization for the iron and steel industry. Everything is extremely expensive. We need a solution to the blast furnace and BOF route. And this will speak more about CCU and CCS technology development. There is a lot of, or a perception that the EAF route will resolve the decarbonization of the iron and steel industry. But we must remember that not all the qualities of steel can be reached via the EAF route. So we need to find a solution for the blast furnace BOF route as well. We will need abundant and affordable access to clean energy. And Alex, in that point, I agree with you. We need that investment. We need that to happen. But that will not be also the silver bullet. We need a lot of things to happen together. We will need scrap in the future, which is a scarce resource in the world. We will need natural gas, which we know we will have an energy crisis approaching. And obviously, we need the green hydrogen developments that were also emphasized in this discussion. I don't know if you are all aware, but last week, we had the final decision on the announcement of closing the long steel sector in South Africa. This is a very important decision. And when you talk about adaptation, Steve, and about how people will evacuate in future, facing climate impacts, it came to my mind the people, the 3,500 direct employees that will be affected, and how will they face this adaptation as well? Not climate change, but a reality adaptation. This will further affect more than 100,000 jobs in the value chain. So this is a reality. This is not based on modeling. So what I want to bring is we need to stabilize our economy. We need to protect industrial development. We need demand. We need growth in the country. You were talking earlier about profitability and the impacts of CBAM. And I can only agree, this will affect our profitability, our competitiveness. But before talking about profitability, we need to talk about sustainability, existence. We want to see a South Africa that is growing, that is developing, and yes, that we need a low carbon future. And I also must agree, I think it was Happy, if I'm not mistaken, independent of what is happening in the global scenario, we will continue in our roadmap because, we have our internal targets, we have a market change, or we expect to have this market change. But we need to have the reality of what is happening in South Africa and to include this not only in the NDC, but other policies that will support the decarbonization in the country. I can tell you, we cannot make this transition alone. Europe said the same. Canada, USA, they are not doing the transition alone. There was a lot of funding involved in form of grants, also in form of loans as well. But they also have a lot of subsidies, which we don't have in South Africa. And when we say, forget about the funding, we will not get it, don't you feel a bit frustrated with the latest news or the figures that were presented? And going a little bit off, but isn't it incredible to spend $300 billion in a war. In such an important matter of the decarbonization and climate change, and the developed countries cannot fulfill that support that was, committed. When we think about Europe and our peers in steelmaking, for example, I can confirm they have the funding, sometimes 50% or more of the decarbonization projects, which we don't have here. Do you know what is happening in Europe at the moment with the steel industry? There is a huge campaign, Save Our European Steel, because of all the struggles that are happening in the world. Is not only in South Africa, but is not a new fact. China has been overflooding the market for many, many years now. There is no protection in terms of safeguards. They are not enough. There is a lot of imports. Energy prices are very high. We can remember when the war between Ukraine and Russia started, and there was this energy crisis in Europe. The first thing that some of the European countries did was to start up coal-based power generation. And that comes together with that.
Can I wrap up, please, Marcia?
Yes, I will speed up a bit, Steve. But comes to that comment that you made earlier. Are we allowed to backtrack? It's about allowing, or it's about what we can do. We are following nations that have support to decarbonize, that have the subsidies, and that backtrack when they need. But where is South Africa there? Our ambition needs to be aligned with our level of readiness for decarbonization. We need to go forward, I agree, and we will continue our decarbonization roadmap, but we need support. And or how can I say, how about making the enablers available, making our energy cleaner, putting all these pieces together that are missing for the decarbonization, and then we become more ambitious. The problem to become ambitious before is that industry will feel that pressure without the support that is required, and that is a problem. So we cannot afford that priced together, and I will not even talk about the carbon pricing. But most importantly, the most vulnerable, the people, will not be able to afford that price either, because all the products will go up with all the carbon pricing and all the required investment that is necessary. We need a sustainable and a just transition, and that includes industry as well. So please, we need to include this thought in the NDC. Thank you, Steve. And
Thank
everyone.
you. I mean, I think what Gina and Marcia are both talking to is this is a question of how we structure and think about the economy. And we need to be very clear about the impacts of the policy measures that we take so that you don't get unintended consequences. And some sectors are strategically very important, employ a lot of people, they're primary inputs into a bunch of processes. And so we need to be carefully thinking about those complexities. Echoes some points that were raised earlier around incentives and not just punitive measures. So some really important points. I mean, to Gina, to your particular question around municipal debt and pricing in general, the PCC does not have a position on that, but we are working on one. And so we recognize part of the electricity recommendations that we made in 2013, 2023, I just took 10 years off for some reason, was that, tariffs are not cost reflective in South Africa. And so no one is recovering the full cost of running the electricity system. Eskom is not, municipalities are not, distributors are not. And so there needs to be some kind of reform, and that links directly to municipal debt. But again, you can't put the price up 70% because people can't afford it. And so how do you manage what you charge to the tariff and what's recoverable from tax? But there has to be some mechanism to recover the full cost of delivering electricity through one of those two measures, either the tariff or a tax. And we don't really fully understand that or even where all the costs are sitting. Excuse me. So the PCC are actually running a big project trying to investigate that, and that will eventually translate into commissioner recommendations, but probably in another 12 months or so. But we're working on that problem and we recognize it and have noted it. Thank you, Gina. Okay, any other questions online quickly? Peter, do you want to go next? Take that as a no. Peter, can you hear us? Okay, good. We're going to come back into the room then and see if there are any comments or any questions at this stage. Any questions or comments? Yeah, we've got one at the back, ma'am.
Thank you, Steve. My name is Faith Ngwenya. I'm from the Chartered Institute for Business Accountants. Mine is more a comment, and really it is taking from the initiatives that we are putting in place as a country. And if one were to sum it up, it is, let us not use first world country strategies to solve a developing country, third world country problems. And that is obviously just taken from one of the participants that are online who spoke to the number of industries that are being closed down as we are forging forward to try and reduce our carbon emissions and also ensuring that our greenhouse gases are brought into control. But we all know that the ultimate result of that is joblessness. It is a decline in the regional, we might not even be looking at the country's economy, but the regional economy. If you look at the companies that have been closed in KZN and what is the impact of that in that province's economy. So we need to just be, this is obviously a request that whatever we are doing, can it seriously consider where we stand as a country and the challenges that we are facing as a country. And whatever solution that we are coming up with, it needs to first look inwardly and then be able to solve the problems that we are trying to solve. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. This message of developing solutions that are specific to our context is one that is universal across all of the stakeholder groups. And it's one of the reasons why the PCC has focused so much on commissioning local research. Let's understand what the local economic and environmental and social research is saying around jobs, around livelihoods, around access to services, so that we can have that clear framing of what works and what doesn't work, because otherwise we're left to guess, you know. So thank you, it's an important point. Okay, good, more hands. We've got one hand here and then two at the central table and then one over here.
Thank you. When Commissioner Mtenjane was speaking, he opened his opening speech by saying that climate action is a team sport. So I fully agree with that. I just want to understand, are there consequences for not adhering to the NDC targets for countries and for not adhering to the Paris Agreement? What happens when we do not do according to what we have committed? Are we allowed to just repeat ourselves, or it will be great to understand if there's any impact in what we are doing with the NDCs.
Okay, thank you.
And also, as having the Climate Act, I just want to understand, because other countries like the Saudis, the UAE, and European Union has ESG targets, which means that everybody is working towards something that is more in a collaborative fashion. Earlier, you said we don't have ESG targets. It means we as stakeholders choose whether we want to have ESG targets or not. So I just want to understand if we have any plans to introduce ESG targets for stakeholders to follow, particularly those that are listed as the biggest emitters.
Thank you. There was a question here or a comment.
Thank you, Steve. My question is
Sorry, please introduce yourself. I'll try to remember to remind
It's
people.
Piladi Mushala from Sasol. My question is with regard to technology transfer. You indicated that is one of the means of implementation. And my question actually revolves around, for example, the appearance as an economy that we are really slow adopters in certain area. For example, in the EV, that remain a challenge maybe due to the high costs. And then particularly for a country where the middle class is seen as a shrinking in terms of wage that is remaining stagnant. And given these economic realities, like how do we plan to engage the consumer in terms of progressing in the implementation? Because we can have the technology, and the NBI spoke about opportunity in that space for the NDCs. But if we don't have a consumer that is ready for that, how do we move along the journey with the consumer to ensure that, for example, that consumer confidence index is considered within the NDC framework and track some of the adoption rate of these new technologies?
Thank you. And there was a question at the back here, and then I'll answer those, and then I'll come to you.
Thank you very much, Chair. So it's more of a comment and also I would say a question. It's with regards to more emphasis that should be put towards I would say more trade flows and more investment into clean coal technologies such as CCUS. So I think it's that part is particularly important to ensure that whilst we are transitioning, we are not doing a complete 180-degree turn from tackling our challenges, especially from socio-economic and the more political aspects of looking at the kind of challenges that we are particularly facing as a country. So I particularly like to echo the views that made more with regards to how we should be looking for solutions that are more tailored to our South African context instead of using Eurocentric approaches to solve our problems. So I think more emphasis should be put into funding more and absorbing the shock in terms of putting more money into research and development in terms of making sure that strategies such as clean coal technologies, they are advancing in our country to make sure that we are creating a balance in terms of also meeting some of the aspects of the energy transition plans and also making sure that we are transitioning at the same time. And on top of that, we also need to be cognizant of the fact that we also need to take into consideration the effects of biodiversity degradation, which is reinforcing climate risks and vice versa. Because in that regard, also we also do have issues of concern where a decline in nature can also negatively affect our environment and also put the lives of people at risk and result in a total collapse of our ecosystem. So I think it's those are some of the aspects that we need to start speaking to within our NDCs, and instead of just maybe looking at climate in a silo or as a factor that exists on its own, but to also look at it from the other aspect as well in terms of how it affects the environment in general, and not just looking at the science and just maybe the social aspect of issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, this is a very important point. When you start looking at issues like biodiversity and oceans and the other SDGs, it also kind of the evidence stacks up for a faster transition rather than a slower transition. And I think this emphasis on trade and other capacity building, other means of implementation is very important. I would just say that on the CCUS, in its applications in coal-fired power, the literature says this is unlikely. Coal-fired power is already not competitive with renewable energy. And so if you add an additional cost where you've got to sequester, transport, and store carbon, it's just going to make it even less competitive. But the role of CCUS and some heavy industry processes like iron and steel, and where you have a pure carbon feed like Sasol has, there's potentially quite a big application there. On the kind of consumer education tech transfer point, this point plagues our team and I, and Simpiwe and I often talk about this as the things that require behavioral change are the hardest things to change. Changing our diets, changing the way we drive, changing the fact that we must use public transport and not our own private cars. Like, these are the hardest things to change. So your point around that role in electric vehicles and electric vehicle transition, something that bothers us. But to just say, one of those behavioral changes, we have to shift people away from thinking about asset purchase and car purchase as a upfront capital cost to a total operating cost. So already today, for many applications, an electric vehicle is cheaper than an internal combustion engine. But because we see that upfront capital costs, it's kind of concerning. The cheapest electric vehicle on the market today is a BYD Dolphin, which is about 500,000 Rand, and the next one up, I think, is a Mini Cooper, which is 650,000 Rand. So these are expensive upfront cars. But if you're comparing it to a BMW 3 Series, is there a 3 Series? You can tell anything about cars. Maybe there's a 3 Series, maybe it's, I don't know, 5 Series. But it's still cheaper to buy that electric vehicle if you consider the total cost of ownership. And so these are the kinds of things that we have to be thinking about. On the sort of idea of sort of consequences of not adhering to the agreement, I'll bring Happy in to talk more about the sort of legality side. But the primary consequences are diplomatic. You get less access to preferential finance. You get less access to trade, depending on who your trade partners are. So if your trade partners are less ambitious, well, there's lower consequences to not meeting your commitments. We should note that our major trading partners are Europe, the UK, so our trading partners are more progressive than some others might be. But it's an important thing to be thinking about. And in terms of the collaborative targets, we're just going to be careful about ESG language. So I think of ESG language as kind of investor, corporate sustainability jargon. Of course, there are a whole range of targets across the public sector that relate to ESG type issues, particularly around the sustainable development goals. And in the climate change space, those targets are being set for us through company budgets and sectoral emission targets. And so those targets exist, but to translate them into your specific corporate language of ESG, that would take a little bit of work on your side. I'm happy. I don't know if you want to comment on the kind of legal side of it.
All right. So just quickly. So in the Paris Agreement, you've got Article 15, which sets up the compliance committee that looks at the obligations of the Paris Agreement. So countries have specific obligations under the Paris Agreement, and one of those is to send and submit, develop and communicate their NDCs, but there isn't a requirement to implement the NDC per se. And part of that is what Steve was referring to, is that it's largely diplomatic and political sanctioning of sorts, and I'll say sanctioning in a loose sense, but it's really peer pressure on you not doing what you needed to do, so you won't be invited to the table, you won't be in a special club, you won't get preferential treatment in certain areas, and you won't be identified, at least in terms of market access, as one of those groups that need to be approached. That's the one. And then if you do not produce an NDC like we didn't in the timeline of February, there's either leniency that is apportioned to a developing country. If it's a developed country, there's a process that is undertaken, but at the end of the day, you go through what they call a facilitative compliance process, where a group of experts at international level try to address your primary problem, if it's data or it's the ability to produce or it's your technical capability, or even just the ability to evaluate what opportunities you might have in your economy to come out with that output being the NDC. So the sanctions and the compliance in the Paris Agreement are quite loose. They're largely procedural, and they're about just making sure that you show up and that you communicate what you're going to do, exactly what you're going to do and how you're doing it and how far you are. We use other mechanisms. You've got the global stock take, you've got the IPCC stuff that's there, and then you've got the peer pressure that comes at a diplomatic political level.
Yeah, I mean, isn't that interesting? I love the phrase facilitated compliance. It sounds quite sinister. I'm going to use it with my kids when they misbehave. I'm going to, guys, facilitated compliance process is about to follow. Thanks, Happy, that was helpful. I'm going to ask that we take 15 minutes. So we've got about half an hour left before lunch. I'm going to take 15 minutes for you to think deeply about things that we can put on the post-it note board. So remembering the questions are high level, what are we worrying about? No, we're not going to do that first because I forgot that there was a question here. Do you still have a comment you want to make? Sorry, I forgot about you. Please go ahead. And then after that, we're going to do the post-it note exercise.
My name is Noktula Ndlovu. Everybody calls me Noki. I am from the Black Business Council, so it was good to see our TG, but I'm here in my capacity as the Indian Ocean Rims Business Forum chairperson for South Africa. So it's IORA. In IORA, we have an overarching theme, which is 26 countries in the Indian Ocean. And South Africa is one of the countries. And our overarching theme for last year and this year is climate change. And I'm here to understand if, first of all, if there's any alignment or a working group for oceans economy on your climate change. That's number one. And also a trade group that focuses on climate change within the presidential climate change. And then I'll also just touch on the skills and the upskilling in preparations for climate change, because I think there's some possible collaborations. We are also looking at a concept note with another dialogue partner in Italy on bringing upskilling in South Africa for hydrology, mudslides, flooding management, because it's a country that specializes in that. And some of our dialogue partners, India is already preparing to send about 300 engineers to this dialogue partner to prepare for the climate change that is happening in the country. So I just want to check if you are also looking at the upskilling or if there's possible collaborations, we could look at instead of working in silos. Thank you.
Yeah, that would be awesome. I always tell people that we're serial collaborators. We'll collaborate with everyone. There is, however, at this point, no working group specifically looking at oceans. We do have a team looking at trade. So we've got a climate finance team within the PCC that is also thinking of trade. They're looking at CBAM, but there's definitely room to collaborate there, and love to hear more of your thinking on those issues. On the skills development, however, we have a big program. And Lindy from the skills team is at the table behind you. And there we're looking at it. Do you want to wave, Lindy, so people know who you are? So please have a chat with Lindy. So we have a big program that's thinking about what are the skills needs? How do we do this over time? How do we drive demand-led skills development rather than developing skills that then go out into the workspace and find no avenues for employment? And part of the program that Lindy's working on is how do we think about economic diversification. So we need to create a lot of jobs in our economy. And so what are the kinds of opportunities? So I'm really interested in these ideas of hydrology and disaster recovery skills that are clearly going to be needed in our economy. So that sounds amazing. So we're keen to chat here. And likewise, the idea is that we all have the opportunity to kind of input into these discussions. Okay, so 15 minutes, earn your lunch. You have to at least put one post-it note up each. We'd like you to please take the time, think deeply about what are the things that you're worried about across adaptation, mitigation, means of implementation, and justice. And we, of course, will think about that and how do we translate that into policy mechanisms and other institutional mechanisms that would alleviate that worry. Then we've got the question around what are the kinds of underlying principles that we want to think about, again, across adaptation, mitigation, means of implementation, and justice. And then finally, and this is the part that people struggle with the most, is what kind of targets or actions do we need to be expressing in the NDC? And again, across those 4 areas. So yeah, please take the time to think about this. There are post-it notes on the table in front of you. Some of you I see have already written up some, so you can start sticking them up. Yeah, so let's do that for 15 minutes and then we will wrap up. Thank you, everybody. And again, as I said, online, you can do this exercise as well. There's an online post-it board. The link is in the chat. So you basically just follow the link. It'll take you to the board and you'll be able to zoom in and out as you would if you were using an iPad or a notepad. And then you can drag and drop a post-it note onto the part of the board that you want to do. Fill it in. You can have short things, you can have long things. Yesterday, someone wrote a veritable essay onto a post-it note, and it ended up being this tiny writing on the post-it note, but it was electronic, so we could at least make it bigger. If you do want to write us a longer submission, we have an email address that's established for this process, mitigation@climatecommission.org.za, and we invite submissions at any time. So no doubt you will get stuck in traffic on the way home and you will have this idea. I should have said this. Why didn't I think of it? And you are welcome to email us on that. And so we're kind of tracking all of these various ways of communicating with us. So that email address is on the screen. Thank you very much. Yeah, and so if you want to submit something longer, you're most welcome. And if you just have an idea in 3 weeks' time that you think is important that we take into account, you can send us a quick email. Okay, thanks everyone. So take 15 minutes to draft your thoughts for the post-it notes, please. Post-it notes for and you're not chatting about the crickets. Hello. Yeah. Okay. Noting. And I would point out that the pattern of your post-it notes is replicating the pattern of previous sessions. We're worried about a lot. We've got something to say about principles. We have almost nothing to say about targets and actions. So maybe with the last couple of minutes, think about some targets and actions that you can think about. Okay, so I note that the whiteboard activity has reduced to 0. So I will quickly wrap up and then we can take lunch and continue some of our chats over lunch. So just to remind you of the process we are running. So as I said, last year we ran a capacity building phase. Those resources are still available to you. So a couple of you asked sort of deeper dive questions around some of the stuff that we covered very briefly in our summary presentation. There are 5-hour-long presentations online that you can go and find out a lot more detail. And if you still have questions after that, you're welcome to email us. So that was kind of phase 1. Phase 2 is now this. We're trying to hear from you what is important to you. And there are a couple of things that came up that I'll go through in a moment. And then we go to the phase of bringing us all together. Let's try to identify where we might differ, perhaps in the level of ambition, and discuss that within across groups. And then the last stage, of course, is drafting the recommendations. The commissioners will then share it with people for public comments prior to sharing it with the president and with his cabinet. And then obviously in this instance in particular, we would share that with Minister George. Throughout this process, we are recording what you are saying. I mentioned that some of what you're concerned about won't find its place directly in the NDC, but we'll find it more broadly within the PCC program. So we'll be recording that as one of the reports that we produce. And again, just to remind you that this is the beginning of a conversation rather than an end. And so please feel free to engage with us after this event, particularly through the mitigation@climatecommission.org.za email address, but you're also welcome to talk to us anytime. So some of the things that we picked up that are important, and just to say it's not the whole list, of course, but some of the things that I heard, regional efforts are important. We can't just focus on South Africa, although at the same time, local solutions in our context were emphasized. We must respond in an opportunistic way. We might find that there are small and quick wins that we can make while we develop and implement the NDC. Lots of thinking about how does business and government collaborate? How do we create a better enabling environment for business action? Acknowledging that a lot of the action is going to take place within the private sector, both from a finance perspective and from an implementation perspective. And that happens in the context of a struggling national balance sheet. And so these are important things to think about. Critical minerals and the opportunities in critical minerals came up. The fact that we have a slightly fragmented policy environment and that we're not receiving necessarily the incentives we would like came up quite strongly. The fact that we must do this in the national interest was a key theme, and that we must align with the pace and scale that we can afford and test the realism of targets. And I think that comes back to the point about credibility. Economic diversification and social security and social support came up really strongly. The risk of missing opportunities if we don't think about the historical context was key. Renewables came up quite strongly in some of the discussions. And then I think the main theme really was around aligning the overall environment. We have to have business and government working together. We have to have aligned policy. We have to have that policy aligned in the direction of our goals. And that if that happens, the private sector actually moves quite quickly. And there were some examples of how we did that. But the overall kind of sentiment was the NDCs need to be more ambitious. We are still in this, was the phrase that Busa used, and this kind of stop-start policy inconsistency is not so helpful. So I think those were kind of the core themes that I got. I think obviously there will be more, and we will capture them all in detail, and we have the posted notes to draw from. So I really want to thank you, those of you that came and joined us here in Johannesburg, but also those of you that are online. We really appreciate your participation, and we look forward to looking at the record-breaking number of online posted notes a little bit later in the day. And again, also those of you online, please do feel free to engage us going forward. And I think from my side, at least, that is a wrap. And we invite you to have lunch with us and chat with us. And lunch will be in the restaurant down the hall. And see you just now. Thank you.
Yeah, so we also invite everyone to sing a happy birthday to Steve, who's decided to spend his birthday facilitating an NDC workshop. So he really takes this work seriously. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Steve.
Happy birthday to you.
Yeah. Thanks. Thank you very much, everyone. I nearly got away with it. Thank you. We'll see you at lunch. Thanks, everyone.